mask, man. Yeah. Yeah, so me too. I'm at that time, my special. The only mask. The only mask. The mask is like there. Yeah. I got two, not even one. Shit. I can talk about. Ready? You ready? Oh my god. This sitting is resumed. Prior to the suspension on Friday last, this Honourable Chamber was debating the estimates of revenue and expenditure 2021 to 2022. To that we revert.
Speaker, order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2021.
Honourable Prime Minister. Mike. Pedro. Mike, you know what?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, as I rise this morning to address this Honourable Chamber in the second reading speech of the annual Appropriations Bill, may I first of all thank you, sir, for keeping charge of this Honourable Chamber in circumstances where you have had over the course of the last year perhaps to deal with more disruption, more challenges, more accommodation, more adaptation than most other persons who have ever held and sat in that chair. And I think it would be appropriate this morning, therefore, for me to thank you on behalf of all of the members of this Honourable Chamber for the seamless and dignified manner in which you have allowed us to carry out our business as a result of this pandemic. And through you, sir, I would also like to thank all honourable other holders of office, the Honourable Chairman of Committees, the Honourable Member for St. Philip North, and of course the Deputy Speaker of the House of Assembly, the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northwest. And I say so conscious that I have been in these honourable chambers, both of them, since 1991. I think that makes it 30 full years and 2 months probably in this honourable Parliament. And never before have I started an estimates of expenditure and revenue debate on the annual appropriations bill looking at screens of myself talking. It is perhaps a most discomforting experience, and I am thanking you for the gracious manner in which you've handled this transition, perhaps to give myself a greater level of comfort before I get into full speed in this speech. But it is a sign of the times, and the sign of the times is captured by the fact that in this honourable house, we are required by the Constitution of Barbados, irrespective of what is happening, to settle the annual estimates of expenditure and revenue in both houses of Parliament before the 31st of March of the year. And even though our country is still operating under directives and curfews of type we have to continue with the business of the country, and in particular bringing us back to a state where all persons can pursue that which they want to pursue. Not in the normalcy that existed pre-COVID, I suspect, but in a new reality that is intended to carry us to where we were going, but with the benefit of the knowledge that the COVID experience has given us, particularly as it relates to how we must do things differently and how we must build forward better. Many talk about building back better, but this government has been very clear that there's some things about back that you don't want to go back to, and therefore that we want to ensure that we are in a position to build forward better. It is against that background, Mr. Speaker, sir, that these estimates therefore have been prepared and settled. And let me at the outset as well also thank the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central, the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, who, sir, because of the circumstances that unfolded at the beginning of the year, has carried unusual burden in the preparation of these estimates along with the officers in the Ministry of Finance. And I would not have been able to have given the level of support and detail as I would normally have in this exercise, and therefore would have more supervised than led the exercise. And for that, I therefore want to commend the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central for his extraordinary commitment over the course of the last 2.5 months that have allowed us, while juggling everything else, to be here today to ensure that the normalcy that is required in our constitutional arrangements can be maintained without exception and without hindrance. I say thank you. Sir, what was the message to him and to us as a government as we prepared these estimates? One, that those among us who are vulnerable and who are still going through an extraordinarily difficult time must be protected as far as our resources allow us to do so. Two, that the government, in the face of a private economy that is floundering, must step up to the plate and trigger public sector-led growth through an expanded capital works program and capital program generally. And three, that even as we do all of this, we cannot take our eyes off the ball of enhancing competitiveness and making it just simpler, easier to do business in this country in a way that has been different from that which we inherited. Those three simple things relate to us being able to take care of our people, us being able to keep the country afloat with a level of minimal economic activity that can keep the supply, the demand and supply of goods and services rolling over, even if not as much as we would like. And thirdly, that we recognize that there is much still to be done, even as we have done a lot already with respect to building competitiveness of our economy to make us fitter for the purpose of growing. Because ultimately, as we have said, even when we were in opposition, you cannot tax your way out of these types of crises, that you have to grow your way. And growth for us must not be jobless growth, but must be growth that is fair, that is equitable, and that produces opportunities and jobs for our people. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is against that background that I ask us, therefore, to come to this debate. I do not propose to be long today, because in all things that we are doing now, precision and strategic focus, laser-like focus, is required if we are going to be able to walk and chew, if we are going to be able to manage the other aspects of the crisis that we have to manage, and if at the same time remain faithful to our obligations under the Constitution and under the good governance framework to which this government is committed. I do want to do an unusual thing at the start, because normally we speak about estimates without carrying the public of Barbados into what is this big book It is so heavy that those of us who use the iPad now are very happy that we can catch it on this, because this book alone in and of itself is an exercise in lifting weights. But this is the Bible. And this is the Bible with respect to government's fiscal arrangements, what we spend, what we earn, what debt we have, all of the details that you want to know about the government of Barbados is in this book, and with respect to the emoluments, the posts in the other schedule of personal emoluments that comes as the second appendix with respect to this. I think that we have so few of these books that I'm even using the one for the member for Christchurch East Central this morning, so if he's looking for his, he left it in my office, because normally we would use the iPad. But this morning, it is important because I want to turn the Honourable House's attention to page 2 of the estimates. And even as I do that, I will ask the clerk at the table for last year's estimates so that I can also turn to page 2 to give the country the stark reality of what we face today as a nation and why we remain committed to making this journey in the manner in which we shall. Thank you. Is this the approved one? No. We want the approved one, which was yellow. I'll use this one for now. But there's the approved one, which is a brighter yellow. Thank you very much. On page 2 of these documents, Mr. Speaker, if you turn to yours, you will see that there is a table 2, which is the revised estimates of revenue and expenditure, and there's a table 3. And why am I doing this? Not for you to become consumed with all kinds of figures. But let's start with the most glaring figure in this. There is, in Table 2, a figure of 10.5 billion. 10,505.9 million, 505.9 million, which is our nominal GDP figure as of March last year, 2020. But when we come to the figure that we are looking at for this fiscal year, we are going to immediately feel that something happened. Because that figure in this fiscal year is now 8,554.8 million. A reduction of just under $2 billion in economic activity loss in the context of the last fiscal year. A loss of almost $2 billion in economic activity as a result of COVID and all that COVID has brought to us. We know it instinctively. We've felt it every month. We know the loss of jobs that we've seen in the country. We know that over 38,000 individuals applied for unemployment benefit last year at the height of it. We know that last month in February, the numbers are in excess of 11,000 who have applied as well again. And we recognize that what has happened has been a major disruption of significant proportion. It is perhaps the largest single drop in our economic performance, certainly since independence, and it is arguable that it is probably the largest single drop since the World War. Mr. Speaker, the next table that I want you to go at before I put these books away is Table 3 and the financing requirement. Last year, this government was able to bring to this Honourable Chamber a set of estimates that reflected that in the fiscal year 2019 to 2020, in other words, the fiscal year that ended in March last year, we did not need to borrow a cent from anyone. And why, sir? Because we were running a healthy surplus. Regrettably, in this fiscal year that will finish in just under 10 days, you will see that the borrowing sum to close the gap is $1,047,000,000. So having had a set of circumstances where this government was able to carry out the affairs of this country without recourse to significant borrowings in the conduct of our annual estimates of expenditure and revenue for 2019 and to 2020, we cannot repeat the same this year, regrettably. And we know why. And this government, therefore, from when I stood here last year, I addressed this honourable chamber on the 20th of March. It was a Friday evening. And I remember clearly indicating that we were going on a journey that no one had ever been on before. It was completely uncharted, and that we would need equally to take care of the most vulnerable among us. At that point, we had only recorded our first COVID case 3 days before I addressed this honourable chamber. And today, I address you now 1 year later, conscious that we have been able to keep the ship of state afloat, conscious that thank God that this government moved with the level of dispatch and urgency that we moved upon being elected. For as I lie down and every night since, I ask myself, what would have happened if we did not insist on going within 1 week of being elected, less than 5 days on the job for all of the ministers in this chamber, with the exception of myself and the AG, for whom it was 8 days on the job, had we not agreed to literally suspend our debt payments, restructure our domestic and international debt, and enter into a program with the International Monetary Fund to be able, more than anything else, for them to endorse our homegrown program and to unlock funding from the international financial institutions who are the development banks, like the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, commonly known as CAF, and of course, the Caribbean Development Bank. In the case of the World Bank, we knew that we were not going to be able to access initially, but we set up the case for exceptional access, which for the first 2 years was unsuccessful, but over the course of the last 9 months, we have been in deep discussions with them to allow Barbados exceptional access once again with respect to concessional funding so that we can continue to bridge the gap. Mr. Speaker, what does this all mean? That had we not done what we had done and completed the restructuring of our debt, Mr. Speaker, I ask all of us to reflect where we would be today with respect to having to borrow $1 billion in order to keep this economy together. And let me put it in context. The last government was not able to go to market after December 2013 when they bought the Credit Suisse loan, when they brought the Credit Suisse loan to the Parliament, largely because no one was prepared to lend money to a government whose credit rating was as low in junk as it could possibly be, was as ridiculously expensive as it could possibly be, and in some instances people were just not interested in lending you full stop, regardless at what interest rate you could borrow at. That was where we had found ourselves. And I can say without fear of contradiction whatsoever that had we not cured that situation with respect to our debt, and had we not also dealt with the unfortunate situation of inheriting foreign reserves at 400 and odd million, that's about 430, 440 million, in circumstances where less than a month we would have been required to lose almost 100 million in debt repayments, we would not be standing here today with the ease with which we do. Is our journey still difficult? Oh yes, extraordinarily so. But can we make it, sir? Yes, we can. And that is the determinant issue that guides us today. That in spite of all that we inherited, we have so managed the affairs of state that we know, in confronting the biggest challenge that this country has ever confronted, we are in a position to see our way through, even though we know that there will be dislocation, disruption, and loss for some, and in some instances for more than we would like to see. Mr. Speaker, sir, it is against that background, therefore, that we look at where we are today. The bottom line is that our revenue, we are hoping at the end of this month that we can meet the projections, and I'm reasonably confident that we should be able to, of $2.4 billion, $2,410 million in revenue. Recognizing, Mr. Speaker, and there is nothing like going to the original documents to begin to see, because I hope that all Barbadians one day will be able to understand how these estimates are set out and what they mean, so that you can understand when government is speaking to you what it is saying. And I say so, Mr. Speaker, conscious that, and perhaps the Ministry of Home Affairs, through its Public Affairs Department, can take the public through one day next year, in time for next year, how to read these documents. But the important point is, sir, is that we are significantly down. Even though we will meet our revenue, we are significantly down in that, thank you, in that receipt of revenue from where we were the year before in terms of actual receipts. And let me record them for you. The year before, sir, we would have recorded in tax revenue 2.931 billion, in non-tax revenue 627.4 million, bringing us to a total of $3.559 billion in revenue. In this year of our Lord that will finish this month, we will be collecting significantly less at 2.269 billion. It is projected in tax revenue, and 140.6 million in non-tax revenue, bringing us to a total of about $2.41 billion. Mr. Speaker, that is more than $1.1 billion less than we would have taken in the previous year. So that when you look at that, and then you look at the reality that our approved expenditure also increased, and the increase in our expenditure really came as a result of us taking back up debt payments for the first time, because you would recall that in the previous year, our debt amortization and our interest on loans in 2019-2020 was at about 550 million. But last year, this year that is now ending, we are spending 882.1 million, a sum of $332 million more just in debt-related expenditure. So that when we look, Mr. Speaker, at the fact that our expenditure has also increased, some due to debt and some due, for example, to an increase in our capital expenditure, significantly so as compared to the capital expenditure of us in government as well as the previous government, then you begin to see that the government literally, in addition to capital expenditure, COVID-related expenditure, and indeed our interest and amortization payments, we would have ended up with revised estimates, Mr. Speaker, of $3.379 billion in expenditure as compared to $2.666 billion the year before. Mr. Speaker, these numbers paint a picture really, because we had committed to coming to make a 6% surplus in this fiscal year again, as we had sought to do before. Where we ran into difficulties, we indicated on the 20th of March when I addressed this chamber that we would probably be going down to 3% and then thereafter to 2% surplus. And it soon became clear to all when we saw the extent to which by June and July, the global economy was being confronted with protracted lockdowns and protracted shutdowns, that we would not be able to make any surplus in this year, my Lord. And we therefore settled among ourselves, as well as with the IMF, that we would seek to make a deficit of 1%, given the massive adjustment that we would have to make. The good news is, sir, is that the financing of that deficit was easy because we had the confidence of the international community and those who would also lend to us, be it from the World Bank, sorry, not the World Bank, the IDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, and the Latin American Development Fund. Without more, they would not have been interested in lending anything to us in a serious way had we not been comfortably progressing in our homegrown program, and had they not had the independent judgment of the IMF that Barbados truly has been performing exceptionally well in its homegrown program. Might I remind this Honourable Chamber that this is a discipline that we have held now in this program since October the 1st, 2018, thereby making it almost 2.5 years that we have been holding this discipline. And it is significant that the confidence that we have been able to engender in the management of the affairs of Barbados has meant that even though it is rough at so many different levels, and believe you me, we feel it, we have been able to expand the support levels for persons within the household mitigation unit, for people who were not working and who were not being dealt with by reason of the expanded payments of the Welfare Department. As you recall, we increased the welfare payments by $10 million, by 50%. We also increased the rates that welfare would pay to their beneficiaries, so that even though we were increasing the total amount, we said at the micro level that welfare must also address how much it was paying people for the different benefits, because those benefits payments had not been increased for almost more than a decade, if my memory serves me correctly. We also, Mr. Speaker, had to take on the reality that there were new classes of persons that would have to be engaged on a one-off basis for us, and I refer specifically to persons assisting the Ministry of Health with the COVID monitoring unit, with the other areas of activity, for example, the community health liaison officers, the primary school monitors for COVID when they were working and back into school. And I'm sure the Minister of Education will come to that very shortly this week, as I'm told she's meeting with the unions and the principals to be able to set a clear time frame and framework for the resumption of school in this country, because children, more than any other category of person, in my view, have suffered disproportionately from this awful pandemic. Mr. Speaker, sir, we were forced, therefore, as well, to look at some capital projects. And if the truth be told, I'm not necessarily happy with the pace with which we were able to move on some of them, but equally, I'm conscious that in a number of instances, a lot of the difficulties have arisen as a result of an inability to be able to get all of the ducks lined up, particularly for government properties that remain derelict and out of use for significant periods of time. And as you would all recall, if you're going to start bringing back, you need to have plans, you need to look at the state of buildings. You need to see whether in truth and in fact your estimates can withstand proper scrutiny, because more often than not it is more difficult to renovate buildings than it is, Mr. Speaker, as you know, to build them from scratch. But having said all of that, I think that you have started to hear in the Standing Committee on Finance, and you will hear more, I trust, between today and tomorrow, of those projects that are now in a position to start going in the different areas of the ministries. Mr. Speaker, against that background, this has been therefore an extraordinary year, and I want to give thanks first to the people of Barbados for allowing us to be able to walk with them hand in hand, knowing the difficulties that they're experiencing, but still being able to meet them as far as we could possibly do. And may I say so, sir, in a more comprehensive way than most countries in the region have been able to do. And it is largely because we confronted the difficult decisions immediately upon coming into office. There are many other countries that are having difficulty in being able to put programs in place, and it is because they have no fiscal space. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to run deficits, somebody has to finance them. Who is it that's going to finance them? And if you don't have easy access to finance, as we found out in Barbados, then you end up with governments and central banks seeking to print money or to do what the developed world is doing much of it now, because they call it quantitative easing, but it is a form of printing money and buying back your own debt instruments in order to create that space. The irony is, I talk to you today and say that we have been exceedingly disciplined and that we have run a 1% deficit, having wanted to run a surplus so that we could use the surplus to pay down our debt, so that by 2033 our debt could come back down to 60%. That was our initial plan. There is no doubt in my mind that we're going to have to look and see how best we can do that now, given the disruption. But the point that I wanted to make, sir, is that the 1% deficit that we are squeamish about, the United States and Canada this year with COVID are running deficits, I'm told, in the vicinity of 16% and 19%. But they can afford to do so, Mr. Speaker, because the cost of borrowing for them is next kin to nothing, almost zero. Very, 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 very cheap. And that is why, sir, and I made this point this morning, at 4:30 this morning, I addressed the African Ministers of Finance in Addis Ababa as they opened their finance ministers meeting. And I did so as chair of the Development Committee of the World Bank and the IMF, starting to begin to address some of the issues that are affecting middle-income states in particular. Because the world gets it. For very poor countries, low income, in part, and they have decided and put in place a debt suspension initiative, a debt service suspension initiative. But the scale of it, for even the very poor, is minuscule in comparison to what they've also put in place for themselves. Now you may say they have no obligation. Maybe, maybe not. But guess what? We so live in an interdependent world that if we ignore others, whether it is on the pandemic or whether it is on climate crisis or whether it is on international economic shocks, everybody at some point is going to feel it, because that is the extent to which our world has become so globally interdependent. But Mr. Speaker, what is of significance is that as we speak, the advanced economies in the face of COVID got a taste of what they tell us not to do because they had to do it themselves. And they got that taste with respect to having to raise significant sums of money to manage and to help them finance their deficits, to be able to support their people. No different from what we are trying to do. But what were the numbers for them as we look at it? They have raised, the world has raised $14 trillion in debt. I know that when we use the word trillion, Bajans feel that we're talking something that children know about only. But it ain't about children, it's trillion. Trillion. numbers that we can't even begin to contemplate. 1,000 billion, trillion, $14 trillion in debt. And of that debt, 11 trillion are to the few advanced economies that do not constitute the majority of the world's population. And 3 trillion are for the emerging market economies for the rest of us. But what is more, of that 3 trillion, the majority goes to just a handful of the larger developing countries like China and India and Brazil. We get hit. So let's come back now to these very low income countries that are benefiting from the debt service suspension initiative. You know how much that is, Mr. Speaker? Remember, the advanced economies borrowing 11 trillion, of which 7 trillion, almost 7 trillion, is quantitative easing, printing of money, buying back your own bonds. The debt service suspension initiative is 11 billion for 72 countries, just on or about, maybe a couple billion more. But the point is that the advanced economies are borrowing 1,000 times that. 1,000 times what they are given in relief to the very low-income countries. But it gets worse, sir. So on the one hand, you have the advanced economies accessing capital at almost zero. A handful, more than a handful, but getting a handful. 72 countries benefiting from the DSSI so that they can have what you call IDA-like terms, International Development Association-like terms. The World Bank group is really made up of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development that the rest of us borrow from, lower middle income, etc., at concessional funds where we can, and get technical assistance and those other things. Or the really very, very poor countries of the world who borrow at highly concessional rates, 25 to 40-year loans, interest rates that are really, really, really negligible. But all like Barbados and Bahamas and all of us can't borrow at those rates because we were graduated some time ago. And that's why we say about going back for exceptional access. But even if we get exceptional access, we are saying that what has happened in COVID has been so debilitating and dread that we need, Mr. Speaker, to be able to ensure that we can have IDA-like terms for a period of time. In other words, that 25 to 40-year instruments for middle-income countries that are extremely vulnerable. And you don't have to know how vulnerable we are because the true test of vulnerability is loss. Last year, this economy declined by just under 19% of GDP. And I gave you the figures here by showing you the difference between a $10.5 billion economy and an $8.5 billion economy where we stand today. Mr. Speaker, what hurts is that these numbers carry us back to even before we lost the government in 2007. And of course, we were already dealing with an economy and a country that had a lost decade by not growing whatsoever. In fact, we had lost during that decade of the last government. We started to come back up slightly, but they left us exactly where we handed it to them in 2008 January. And now then, to have this on top of it means that in truth and in fact, Barbados is suffering from a significant contraction and that the hole is deep, but we can get out of it if we can put the right policy mix together and if we can continue to access capital at affordable rates to resume the development trajectory. In the middle-income countries are being told that you must borrow from the development banks. Great, and we want to. But they too have an issue because the development banks are lending at 3, 4, and 5%, which is significantly higher than what others, as I just told you, are borrowing at. But more importantly, significantly higher than what the market is lending to advanced economies. And you begin to ask yourself, how can the world get out of this if it leaves on the table that wide range of middle-income countries who are being asked to pay, as in the case of Bahamas, 8 and 9% for debt. Ghana goes to the market in 10 days. We don't know at what price they will access it. And others are hesitant to go because of the very difficult set of circumstances, which, in spite of the external nature of the pandemic, has led to downgrades for a number of middle-income countries themselves, because, of course, they've had to increase their debt. And their debt to GDP ratio goes up in order to be able to keep their people alive and not literally falling away either from COVID itself or from the economic deprivation that has resulted from COVID being in the countries. Mr. Speaker, it therefore means that we've said to them, you cannot continue to use historic per capita income to determine who should borrow at low rates, at low rates or not. You can't. Because when you do so, you're using per capita income from 2 years ago, a year at best, but more often than not 2 years previous. And it is the equivalent of your taking my blood pressure from 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, to ask whether I'm going to get a heart attack or a stroke today. Now, how useless and obsolete could a blood pressure reading from 2 years ago be in determining what I should be treated with today, 2 years later? And we are simply saying, Mr. Speaker, that when you take COVID and then you bring back the reality of the climate crisis before 2020, when we stood up in this honourable chamber, we were telling you about the difficult amounts of expenditure that we would have to carry in this country as a result of the climate crisis. Recognizing that for us in the region, the climate crisis doesn't only present itself in the heart attack type features like hurricanes, but it also presents itself in the very, very insidious and debilitating forms like a groundwater crisis. Like when you stood in this chamber last year and heard that our water in Bowmanston had gone in the reservoir from 17 feet of level of water to 4 feet. That's the groundwater crisis. And it's not just Barbados that is suffering that. This is in Central America, in North America, in Asia, in Latin America. All of us, because of what is happening with the climate crisis. We talk about it also in terms of the sargassum weed. The Minister for Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy continues to ask this honourable chamber for money to be able to clean up the beaches and to be able to ensure that he does not leave those persons who do business on the coast in the areas where the sargassum piles up, does not leave them exposed to the horrid smells and the horrid sight of the sargassum that has come as a result of the climate crisis once again and global warming. Mr. Speaker, these were not things that my predecessors had to deal with in any serious way. But we now face a Barbados where we must manage now the twin crises of both COVID and climate. And may I dare say that it comes on top of the other C's, the consequences of colonialism, where we were set upon an independence compact without any funds to be able to deal significantly in a major way with education and housing and health and economic opportunities. And at the same time, we fight and continue to fight the domestic seas like chronic non-communicable diseases that, as we have seen even in our management of the COVID pandemic, has been the underbelly that has made parts of our population even weaker and more vulnerable to this virus, especially in terms of their capacity to recover. Mr. Speaker, why am I starting here? Because it is important that Barbadians understand the context against which we are managing their affairs and recognize that even though it is difficult, the one great thing is that we have managed to maintain confidence in the administration of the affairs of this country, and we continue to meet the targets that we say for the most part that we are meeting. There may be one or two internal ones that we've had to adjust, regrettably, but the bottom line is that even when we do so, we are doing so to ensure that we can protect the most vulnerable among us. As I said last year, what was the metaphor I used? Keep your head above water. Because as long as we can keep our head above water, even if we have to tread water, we have the body stock, we have the human stock, we have the capacity to resume the heavy lifting when we can do so, when there is a relative all clear with respect to the pandemic. Mr. Speaker, we have for the most part managed to achieve that. And it is regrettable that we have lost some Barbadians and families among us. Last week, Wednesday I believe it was, I took time to pay tribute and to thank yet again the healthcare workers and all of the other frontline workers that have allowed us to be able to manage this pandemic in the way in which we have done, protecting as many of us as possible, and where persons have not been able to escape the actual virus, making sure that they can be as comfortable with the majority of them recovering for the most part. Regrettably, where we have lost some, we empathize and we sympathize with their families and express condolences, because none of us would have liked to have lost anyone. But regrettably, the world in which we live is one that has been plagued by plagues periodically, that has had to fight up with wars that have led to loss of life. And as we know only too well, between accidents and violence continue to take people from us in a way that we would not want to see. But Mr. Speaker, if we can create that space in the middle for middle-income small island states or middle-income countries that do not have easy access to the international capital markets and who are vulnerable, because we literally are in that zone where climate is going to get us, then I believe, Mr. Speaker, we will have succeeded in being able to ensure that we can have access to money to allow us to build the resilience and to do the level of adaptation necessary so that we can better face the consequences of a world that is plagued by pandemic and COVID, pandemic and climate at the same time. And why, Mr. Speaker? In the United Kingdom, in Britain, when they finished the World War, if they had to go and service war debt straight away, they could not have rebuilt the United Kingdom easily. They couldn't. And the mere fact that they were able to stretch out and spread out the servicing of their debt incurred during the war over decades, such that they could borrow to resume the development path, to provide housing for their people again, to provide education and health care for the people who had gone through a war and whose personal circumstances invariably were decimated, for whom many of them were impoverished. All of these things made it imperative that Britain could get on with the task of rebuilding Britain without being told that there is no fiscal space or there's no money for you to be able to do it. And Mr. Speaker, what do I ask today? That we ask for the same thing for ourselves, and more so, because of our size, there is an inherent vulnerability. As I ended this morning in speaking to my colleagues in Africa, I pointed out that in my view, Africa has to take leadership on these issues along with the Caribbean and the Pacific countries, for whom our grouping represents just a little more than a third of the global states. And it is imperative that we say to institutions that were created before we were allowed to exist as independent states. The international financial institutions and the United Nations were both formed in the 1940s, before we became independent countries. And therefore our circumstances and our actual structures in those organizations, the structures do not take into account our circumstances or our reality as sovereign states that have emerged from a colonial past. It is unfortunate that it has not necessarily been allowed to influence the governance structures, and that battle remains a long battle from the Security Council's membership, right back through to how the Bretton Woods institutions function in being able to deal with our countries. But what is significant is that it places us in a us and them situation still, just as we were in 1945 when these institutions were created. How do you have a few of them raising $11 trillion, ensuring that vaccine access is guaranteed to a handful of advanced economies? And as Pope Francis said, all of the fault lines, all of the warts come out in a crisis, as the pandemic has shown us. So 11 trillion to 11 billion. Do the comparison, us and them. Vaccines for a handful of countries. And the reality is, even as we are grateful as we roll out our vaccine program for the gifts given to us by the government and people of India, and other discussions that we're having with others, we have determined that we must buy what else we need. Because we cannot wait until the end of 2021 or 2022 to be able to ensure that our people can get back to a sense of relative comfort in doing their business and being able to engage and employ people again, and for the functioning of the economy and the society in ways that we are more accustomed to, even if we build it forward better, as we must be committed to do. When you consider these things, Mr. Speaker, this us and them dichotomy has really pushed us to the point, in my view, where we must work collaboratively and come together, as we have done on all of the big issues of our time, in the fight against colonialism, in the fight against apartheid, and I say to you now, in the fight to secure the development trajectory of the developing world, who have been left outside yet again, in order to preserve and protect the space of the advanced world. Mr. Speaker, we would hope that we could have learned from the lessons of history. And once again, the pandemic provides the best metaphor for it. Because what are we really up against? If we do not make sure that there is equitable access to vaccines, there will be continued new strains. And the continued new strains anywhere put all of us everywhere at risk ultimately. We pray not, but we know the potential for that risk exists. And that is why I've said from last year that more than anything else, the world needs strong global moral leadership. That strong global moral leadership would have ensured that there is a clearinghouse for vaccines that takes into account that not everybody can execute and to vaccinate people all at the same time in large numbers. You ask me why, when we received 100,000, that we started to give out some. Because we come from a culture that says that we must take care of those among us who are most vulnerable. And even if it means sometimes that you have to literally cut the cloth a little tighter, we do it. And I'm happy to say that in my experience, both as Prime Minister of this nation and my personal experience, generosity begets generosity. It is as simple as that. So, Mr. Speaker, against that background, we have had to fight some challenges. I'm spending this time setting the international circumstances because it is important that Barbadians understand that it is that extra fiscal space or that extra policy space. And you ask me, why have we taken on these additional responsibilities? Because I need to be able to argue that middle-income small island states like Barbados need to be able to access capital at a cheaper rate, so that instead of spending $300 and something million in interest, 360 million in interest this year, and next year our interest goes to 414 million. that when we borrow, we want to be able to have access to the same low interest rates that others are doing. Fortunately for us personally, because we are borrowing from the IMF in many instances, our rates of access at the IMF is just over 1%. And therefore, when people ask, why did you go to the IMF? Because at the end of the day, we were going to be adjusting and making adjustments internally in our homegrown plan anyhow. So if you're going to take the burden of adjustment, you can as well take the benefit of the adjustment. And the benefit of the adjustment comes in the exceedingly low interest rates from the IMF. But that only takes care of a certain percentage of what we need. And that is why I say that ultimately, whether it is the international, the multilateral development banks, or the regional development banks, or whether ultimately it is when we go back to market, there is a case. Because we want to build resilience to be able to protect us more should a hurricane hit us, God forbid. Not would, that it doesn't. We want to be able to ensure that we can mitigate against the groundwater crisis. And the people from St. Lucie to St. Andrew to St. Joseph to St. John to St. Philip to parts of St. Thomas and St. James, parts of St. Michael. We know it. But we can only do so. We have money sitting down in PBLs that we could use, but we're constrained by what we can bring to book because we are constrained by the deficit or the surplus targets that we have. And that is why we will come back here to finish out and roll out the year with supplementaries tomorrow and if necessary Monday, not to increase what we spend, but to shift around what we are spending so as to make sure that we don't leave things on the table that could otherwise hurt us as we go forward. Mr. Speaker, this has not been an easy exercise. And that is why you see me thank the Ministry of Finance officials and the Honourable Minister. And to that I add the rest of the economic team, the member for St. Michael South Central, and the others who have been working assiduously. And you know, sir, I therefore am not going to ever go on the defensive because we've had to bring in skills to add to what we had in order to protect this nation and to protect the finances of this nation, in order to allow us to find the resources to be able to spend $20 million on the household mitigation unit and another $10 million, as I said, carrying it to near $31 million for welfare department last year, but still having to thank and get additional donations from Barbadians, and I want to thank all those Barbadians who literally donated to the Adopt a Family program. I will make sure that the figures are given by either the member for Christchurch East Central or St. Michael South Central before the end of the debate. But bottom line is, in addition to that, we then had the donation by the Sandy Lane Charitable Trust and others. And Mr. Speaker, this has been, as the member for the City of Bridgetown likes to call it, it has been a whole of nation approach, not a whole of government approach, a whole of nation approach. And even as I speak, those who donated to the COVID-related charity that was significant in purchasing significant amounts of PPE for us, and that have also contributed to the payment of vaccines for COVAX. And Mr. Speaker, as I said, even as I speak, we launched the National Vaccine Fund last week, and already in it, we have just under $7 million in donations. $6 million alone have come from Sandy Lane Hotel and its owners, and we want to thank them. And when I asked them whether they wanted me to make it public, they said only insofar as it would spur others to want to do the same thing. Mr. Speaker, we expect, as this Honourable House will find out in a supplementary, that even with all that we have done, with the multiple irons that we have in the fire, that we will have to spend on or about $25 million with vaccines, and therefore that is an additional expenditure beyond that which we would normally have had to spend. And we are committed to it because it is to protect Barbadians. Whether persons choose to donate or not is a matter for them. But this government will spend the money to save people's lives and to protect Barbadians in this country. And we do so conscious that even as we have vaccinated 62,000 Barbadians, more than 25% of our adult population, that we are conscious that the effort to do the rest is still difficult. Because when I tell the country, I saw somebody send me yesterday, somebody making the same comment that I've made to the country over and over, that out there dealing with PPE and dealing with ventilators and dealing with vaccines has been the wild, wild, wild west. And that countries who are former colonies like ourselves have been left to the ravages of the market. And if you are a small nation or a small island like us, you better hope that somebody sees you, because invariably we are too small to be heard or seen in the international market, and that is what makes life more difficult. And when people see that the advanced economies, and in fairness, the advanced economies in some instances would have provided the funding to get a lot of the research off of vaccines. So you can't quarrel from the perspective of the pricing that they may have been able to negotiate. But where we have a difficulty is when you lock off supply such that the only supply left to countries such as ours is either donations, as we have gotten, and we're grateful for that, or going through middlemen who charge higher amounts than those that are available to the advanced economies. And whether we like it or not, that is our reality. That is our reality. So that you will end up paying, on average, 24 to 25 US a dose for AstraZeneca in circumstances where those developed countries will get it at a fraction of that cost. Now you can wait. We can wait. We just don't know when we'll be waiting until. We just don't know whether it's a never, 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 never plan. We don't know. And I am not prepared to take that chance with Barbadians' lives. And let me place it in context again. It cost us, as I indicated, between 19 to 20 million US, 38, 39 million Barbados dollars a week in economic activity to keep this country closed in February. Am I going to quibble then on 25 million, which is $13 million less than the 38 million in lost economic activity? Or are we going to cut and contrive and make it happen? Because we know once we can do that, we are going to open back up the possibility of more economic activity in this country for everybody. Mr. Speaker, the choice is simple. All right? Mr. Speaker, the choice is simple. Very, very simple. And I therefore ask this Honourable Chamber, when the supplementary comes, to support it. As I said, the good news is that there are a lot of people with kind hearts who recognize that this is not a situation that the country chose for itself. It's a very difficult moment, and therefore there are a number of people who have come forward who have said they want to contribute to offset what the burden will be on the taxpayers of this country. For them, we say thank you, and we will continue to proceed. Mr. Speaker, if I can come to some more specifics related to this, because as I indicated to you, these estimates intend to bring back some level of support to protect the vulnerable. So you will see sums in here still for the Household Mitigation Unit and an expanded amount for the Welfare Department. And when the Honourable Minister for People Empowerment speaks, I'm sure she will speak to the expanded provisions for her ministry yet again for another year. We are still committed to the social reforms that are necessary in that ministry in order to be able to unlock the agency of the family. And it was that, I believe, that I offered the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and others for us to come together as one in order to be able to see how we can support and protect families and to be able to help them engage in the battle of saving more and more of our younger people in this country, with notion that parents, parental education is critical. I've said it to the Minister of Education. I've said it to the Public Affairs Division. I hope to see programs, short vignettes, short little memes go out to reinforce what it is that we want to exemplify with respect to parenting in the country. recognizing that it is critical to do so so that our children are anchored and rooted as they grow up. Similarly, we've seen also that we have to continue our level of spending in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Mr. Speaker, let me put it in context. If we were not still fighting COVID, we would hit our target easily that we would have wanted to come in close to 2% surplus in these estimates that we are laying for the next financial year, 2021, 2022. Indeed, were it not for the COVID spend, our target would be met at 1.92% surplus. With the COVID spend, which we have isolated, and my colleagues globally are doing the same thing. I raised it only recently with my co-chair in the Development Committee, the minister from Uruguay. They are doing the same thing because we cannot hit these one-off expenditures easily and still maintain the tight targets that we would otherwise have wanted to maintain. But we are conscious that we can probably turn the corner on the pandemic if the world gets its act together with the vaccination. Not just Barbados, but the world. And obviously we want to get ours as fast as possible, but we want to urge others globally to do so. Against that background, as I said, we are running a deficit of 0.32%, not a deficit, sorry, a surplus of 0.32%. In other words, we are not seeking to literally borrow money this year in order to be able to deal with our circumstances. The bottom line is, sir, that had we not had COVID, we believe we would be running a surplus easily of almost 2% this year. But we've had to pause. And the last 3 months have been difficult in this nation, as you know. We have not at any time stopped to say that we are not going to take care or to spend or to do what is necessary to protect Barbadians. In most countries, persons with COVID are not even taken into isolation facilities. They are left in their houses to recover. And it is only those who get really, really, really sick that are going into hospitals. Equally, in many countries, hospitals and health systems have been overrun. But we forgot that this government took a decision at the end of February last year to bring back into occupation and to use a building that used to be the naval base of the United States of America, but that we have repurposed twice before, once for the Barbados Youth Service in the mid-1990s, and once in the mid-2000s for the prison while the new Dodds prison was being built. When we went there, the Honourable Attorney General and myself at the end of February, after leaving the renaming of the road after your predecessor, Speaker, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure if that means that one might be renamed after you in the future. I didn't say that loudly, did I? But the bottom line is, when we left there, what we confronted was 12 to 15 foot of bush. And the Honourable Member for St. Lucie, in whose constituency it is, but who at the time had responsibility for Ministry of Public Works, would have seen it, I believe, himself. And therefore, when you go to Harrison's Point today and you see what exists there, the fact that we were able to construct more acute ICU beds, intensive care beds, than this country had ever before. We were hovering in the 30s. We have 78 primary ICU beds at Harrison's Point, nothing at all to do with what we have in Martindale's Road at Queen Elizabeth Hospital. We have another 80 secondary ICU beds also there. So that my friends, sorry, it's 80 altogether. It's 48 and 38. 40 and 38. But my friends, when you add to that then, Mr. Speaker, just under 150 other beds in the tertiary component, we recognize that we had enough to get us through that intense period. We knew always that we would use the additional hotel plant for additional isolation and quarantine facilities as we have had to do from day one. Paragon was the base for quarantine, but throughout it all, we also used Blue Horizon, Worthing Court, the Hilton Hotel, and others to supplement the quarantine-type facilities that we use to help maintain as much division and separation from those who were infected or waiting to find out if they were infected from those who were in the rest of the population. So I say to you, Mr. Speaker, that our head is definitely still above water. It has been a difficult journey, but it is one that we can continue to make, knowing full well that we gave ourselves the capacity to fight this battle in a way that perhaps is stronger and better than most others who had equally to prepare themselves. And why? As I said, because we gave ourselves that fiscal space by restructuring our debt. It's not that we believe that we care more than any other country. I don't. And I know that any leader who stands where I stand would want to do as best as they can for their people. But a large part of it comes in how you plan and how you execute. And mercifully, by taking the decisions that we took, we were in a position to deal with it in a particular way. Mr. Speaker, on the details of the program, the fiscal program for 2020 to 2021 that was approved last year, as I said, showed current revenue of $3.142 billion, current expenditure exclusive of amortization of $2.403 billion, and capital expenditure of $203.3 million. While the projections on an accrual basis showed a net operating balance of $489.3 million, or 4.5% of GDP when converted to a cash basis, the projection was for a fiscal balance of $279.1 million. The overall deficit of $265.6 million, or 2.5% of GDP, inclusive of amortization, was expected to be financed by foreign sources in respect of the capital project inflows. The provisional data from the Accountant General, sir, for the period April 1st, 2020 to January 31st, 2021 shows that government collected revenue, current revenue of about $2,071.4 million, a decrease of $322.4 million, or 13.5% less than current revenue for the same period 2019-20. I've given you examples of all of this and I've shown you how the overall estimates have likely to contract. It is projected that $338.9 million will be collected during February and March of this year to roughly yield $2,410.3 million. This is $633 million less than the original projection. This is $633 million less than we originally projected. The only good news is that as of this morning, I can say that we have met the financial target of $2.41 billion in revenue, so that while we knew it would be $633 million less, at least we are meeting the targets that we've set ourselves internally so that we can bring some level of order and discipline as we go forward. And I thank us for being able to do so. The key in this is for people to help and continue paying. We know that everybody is not in the same position, but you cannot run this country unless we resume some level of order in terms of what we pay and what we receive as a government in order to keep the affairs of state rolling over. Under the circumstances, therefore, the government adapted its fiscal stance in line with the changing environment. I told you that earlier, that we moved and adapted again, and we set ourselves a target just around September, October last year of a 1% deficit, as opposed to what we had originally hoped to be doing had we not gone into the pandemic. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, 2020 was supposed to have been our year of liftoff, with a range of projects and a range of programs, a range of investments, and all things. You heard it last week, Monday, when the officers from the Ministry of Energy told you that government's offshore oil program literally exploration program with BHP literally had to be put on pause because of the inability for them to undertake the travel that was necessary for them to get the program going. We hope that those things, such as also the other investments in major hotel plant and other investments in other types of infrastructure, as well as in the new areas of renewable energy and medicinal cannabis, we hope that they will all come through over the course of time of this year, recognizing that we have effectively lost that year because of, I think countries are talking now about still going into their third wave, even as we come out of 12 months of pandemic. So, Mr. Speaker, we are comfortable that many of the projects that we expected hopefully will still be able to make it, but we do need to be patient and to recognize that those projects equally have been a victim of the sharp economic global contraction and reduction in demand, and that people are waiting to see where things will level back out. You already see the people in the United States of America talking about a 6.5% economic recovery this year that they expect. Those numbers, I anticipate, will change again because more often than not, that society is one that is driven largely by confidence. And the more people that are vaccinated there, I suspect you're going to see a significant return to economic activity in the North Atlantic countries. Our concern relates to how, as I said earlier, developing countries such as ourselves, many of whom are in the southern hemisphere like ourselves, will continue to rise out of this difficult economic space in which we find ourselves. Provisional data for the period. Let me go say one other thing before I leave last year's revenue. You know, sir, they say better to be born lucky than to be born rich. Many people may not remember that in this honourable chamber, both myself and I believe the member for St. Michael North, the Minister for International Business, would have spoken about the fact that we expected to get a significant receipt of corporation taxes from the anti-hybrids and other things as we moved into our new corporate tax framework. Fortunately for us, our revenue situation would have been significantly worse off if we did not collect what was about $200 million more in corporation taxes than would normally have collected in that particular year, 2020, much of which was one-off expenditure, one-off revenue, sorry, that we anticipated we would collect because of what we knew was coming down from 2 years prior. So, Mr. Speaker, we're grateful for that, as I said, and the improvement in the corporation tax collections. If you look at the document with the revenue, you will see that our income taxes are down. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, this government engaged in an ambitious program of income tax and corporation tax reform, if you will recall, between 2018 and 19. And I've not come here today to raise any taxes. And as we know, this is really the budget. But in spite of everything that we've done, we have taken a decision internally that we believe so long as we can get economic activity moving again in this country fully again, the tax structure that we have should be adequate to carry us through. And what has bridged us, as I said, is the fact that the confidence that we've created internationally has allowed others to step forward and provide the funding to build that bridge such that we do not have to go back to Barbadians and to inflict taxes at the very time that they're not in a position to receive them or pay them. And to that extent, I say to you, confidence is the most important currency that this government has literally traded in by being able to show people that when we say we will do X, we do it, particularly in our economy and financial affairs, and that in so doing it and in so delivering, we have been able to garner the confidence necessary such that I do not have to come back and adjust the tax structure at this point in time, and certainly not for the reason of just bridging the gap. If we go back at taxes, it should be to enhance efficiency and not just simply at this point to continue to bridge the gap between what we earn and what we spend. It has not been easy, sir, but we believe that this is the right way to go. And I say so, conscious that our corporation taxes moved from 385 million the year before in 2019-20 actual receipts to 502.3 million this year. And that therefore has helped us get through this difficult period. But at the same time, we've had a significant contraction in income taxes, and that would have been expected with the level of layoffs that you had last year. Because at the end of the day, if people are not earning, they're not paying taxes, and at the same time, they're drawing down the unemployment benefit. And we have, therefore, as I said, to be able all along to ensure that we stabilize our social security system going forward for the future. The income taxes went from 492.9 million in 2019-20 down to 303.7 million is the projected amount expected for this year. So you see a significant reduction. At the same time, value-added tax also went from $1.041 billion in 2019-20 down to $700 million we project to be taken in this fiscal year, a reduction of over $340 million in value-added tax receipts as a result of the pandemic. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? Even with all of that, this government here has given back more tax refunds in this fiscal year that we speak than the last government gave back in any of the last few years in which it was in office. Mr. Speaker, we have given back over $62.6 million in refunds in this year alone in income taxes. $62.6 million in income tax refunds alone, Mr. Speaker. And I'm saying that conscious that, you know, when we say these things and we talk about what government has done and hasn't done, more often than not, people ignore the fact that we've brought back regularity to the payment of income tax refunds and corporation tax refunds and value-added tax refunds, even as we paid off over $400 million in arrears already that we inherited, and still have another couple $100 million, just $300 and something million to pay off. Because every time you think you've turned the corner, they find something sitting down in some part of a program or some drawer that wasn't found there. And I'm saying to myself, but how much more cleaning are you going to ask this government to do? That every time I turn left or right or forward or backward, all I'm doing is cleaning up. And when I saw the cover of The Economist magazine earlier this year with the President of the United States of America in front of a White House that was blotchy and dirty with a mop and a bucket, I said, oh, if only they took pictures of small states, they would have had one of us, because all we've had to do is to clean up. CLECO, British American, I can go on and on. There is one large set of huge expenditure that is still before us to resolve along with these arrears, and that is the monies owed to people whose land was compulsory acquired without compensation for more than a decade. Mr. Speaker, you know, we are trying to put the affairs of state back on an even keel so that Barbadians can have confidence too in the affairs of how the affairs are managed by the government. And the bottom line is, sir, that we've tried to do it by keeping current with our tax refunds, while at the same time working down the arrears that exist, conscious that that needs to go according to our cash flow and to our resources. But we are committed where possible, even where we have to discount the payments, as we did. When you recall in 2018 and 19, as we were clearing arrears, trade payables, etc., we were giving people 85 cents in the dollar. And we may have to come to an arrangement with the existing arrears that are there, some as far back as 1998. And the Honourable Attorney General would tell you that technically speaking, the statute of limitations only goes back 6 years. But even with that, there has to be a conscience, because the victims of that kind of wicked and unfortunate behavior were the citizens of Barbados, not the citizens of Tanganyika. Citizens of Barbados. And therefore, a government can choose to stand only on its legal rights, but be conscious that its own people will be the ones who are being hurt. Or we can try to be reasonable and say, look, we can't do what is exactly there, nor are we legally obliged to do it, but we feel that we must do something to you to make up for the fact that your government unfared you over a period of time. And Mr. Speaker, we are doing all of that as we continue to speak, to manage the affairs of the country going forward. As I indicated, VAT refunds for this year down to the end of February, $87 million in VAT refunds. Now, what you had before was a government that would not have been accounting for that $62 million in refunds for income tax, or the fact of the $87 million in VAT refunds, or the corporation tax refunds that are there. And therefore, they would have given you that as an addition to the revenue. So instead of saying 2.41 billion, we would have been saying 2.5 something billion, or closer to 2.6 billion. But that does not help us, because if we don't pay back the people the money that is owed, then it will not circulate in the economy. Mr. Speaker, therefore, as I said, the revenue situation continues to be fragile, but we believe we can hold it so long as economic activity is allowed to come back, rather than seeking to go at tax rates again in order to be able to close the gap. We do not believe now is the time for that. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, as I said, with respect to expenditure, from the period April 1st, 2020 to January 31st, 2021, government incurred current expenditure of about $2.529 billion, inclusive of amortization, which was an increase of $293.9 million, or 13.1% above current expenditure for the corresponding period of the previous fiscal year of 2019-20. It is projected that a further $682.1 million will be spent in February and March. That would leave us to a revised current expenditure figure of $3.211 billion. This is $75.8 million more than the approved amount on the cash basis for the 2020-21 fiscal year. Expenditure on wages and salaries is projected to increase by $12.5 million to an amount of $819.9, although I personally believe, Mr. Speaker, that that wages bill is going to come in slightly less than that even again. Bottom line is, however, that we have had some limited increase, and it is mainly for the COVID-related expenditure that I referred to, the COVID monitoring unit, the community health liaison officers, the persons who had to be engaged also to input the data coming out of the different apps, as well as the results coming out of the tests. You can't be giving back 500, 700, 1,000 test results daily without having people coming in to input the data, as well as to take the data out and to call the people. Has it been perfect? Not always, but in fairness to them, we literally put people in place and told them run at the same time without having the opportunity to get themselves attuned and to do the things that you would normally do in an orderly way with any other government program or project. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, expenditure on goods and services is expected to decrease this year. Why? Because we tried to hold a line as we were going up one way on other expenses. We said, look to ministries, hold the line as far as possible, and that savings of $19.5 million, or roughly 5.2% of the $356 million, we believe that we can, with all of the savings that we find, we can provide much needed funds to some critical state-owned enterprises whose money does not lapse when we provide the money to them, and hence they will be in a position to move into the next fiscal year from April better provisioned as we seek to reorient and reorient our expenditure to better suit what can be spent, will be spent, will not be spent. Mr. Speaker, We have, as I said, this year, in addition to the whole household mitigation unit, we also spent money to be able to deal with additional laboratory services. We had to buy swabs and reagents and testing kits for the course of the year. That led to supplementaries being approved by this Honourable Chamber of $6.2 million for the lab services, $8.5 million to Government Procurement Department to purchase the food stores and the PPE as a result of COVID, $2.3 million to develop and implement an IT system of KIPO, although I think that money will now be reverted into the next fiscal year because of difficulties with concluding the contract. $2.2 million to meet the cost of maintenance services at Her Majesty's Prison at Dodds. $2 million to the NCC for the engagement of the 360 contract workers initially at the Barbados Beautification Project. $4.3 million for the school monitors for the nursery and primary schools. $2 million for the renovations for the nursery and primary schools under the domestic summer program. They would have had money voted to them already, so this was just a top-up. And $7 million to acquire smart cards of the National Digital ID System and citizen engagement and the communications plan. Some of that will not fully be spent this year, and therefore will have to be, I think it may have been moved in already on Friday. Mr. Speaker, in respect to, but the majority of that has already been spent, and as I understand it, the plan for the National Digital ID cards, the pilot will start in April, and then the full rollout for Barbadians will start the 3rd of May. Why is this necessary? Mr. Speaker, if we had this card, we could easily have pushed cash transfers to citizens rather than having to get the Barbados Defence Force moving from house to house to house in what perhaps has been the largest logistics exercise in this country for decades. And I hope that we don't have to do it again. If we have to do it again, it is because COVID has gotten worse, which I suspect we're not going to see because of the level of vaccinations that we have, or that we've been hit by a hurricane, which I equally not would against, because that too will have obviously devastating consequences to us. With respect to current transfers, those of course will increase, and those increase by $102 million, $102.3 million, or an increase of 10.5%. And why again? The majority of current transfers are increased because of our increases to the Welfare Department, the Household Mitigation Unit, the National Assistance Board to establish the Elderly Care Program, which hasn't gotten off the ground yet, but I hope will get off. It started, but not in the comprehensive way in which we hope to see it, and we expect from early April to begin to see it ramp up even more. And of course, they would have been affected by the shutdown as well too, before getting on their feet fully. The monies to $5.9 million for the BADMC to upgrade the irrigation infrastructure at Spring Hall Land Lease and at the River Plantation Land Lease Program. Since when I visited a number of those areas in July last year, we recognized that we need to be able to improve irrigation. We still have to confront the very difficult problem of two prices of water for farmers in this country. One that is significantly higher for those who are paying Water Authority directly as opposed to those who are paying at the BADMC rate, which is next kin to nothing when compared to that. $7.1 million to BAMC for the sugar crop of 2021, $48.8 million to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital for COVID-19 expenditure, $10.7 million to the QEH for its current operations as opposed to COVID, $2.1 million to BRA for the maintenance of the TAMIS program. And I want to pause here at this point because this country has been the victim of the most set of unfortunate circumstances for the procurement of software in too many instances of government departments. And software that when we check it, we have either negotiated poorly because they're asking us to be able to pay large sums of money for basic changes when we should not be paying, and I'm referring to what happened at the Water Authority with the software that we've inherited there. I'm referring to what happened equally at the Barbados Revenue Authority. And Mr. Speaker, I've asked for a meeting with them along with the Attorney General, because it cannot be that we as a nation continue to pay people to develop programs. And in the case of this TAMIS, what bothered me is that we are unsure of what their previous experience was. And now we are having problems all of the time in getting the systems working well, starting from when we first came. And the first thing they told the Attorney General and myself is that they would have to postpone the start of TAMIS, if you recall, largely because of the confusion, and that was June 2018. And Mr. Speaker, it has been nothing but headache from headache with respect to that program. The government will have to make a determination as to whether we want to continue, if we can't renegotiate on proper terms, whether we will remain with a noose around our necks, or whether we will get rid of that noose and try to start again with something that makes sense for our circumstances. These things are not righteous, and I trust and pray that we can get through them as soon as possible in a way that makes sense for the country. Mr. Speaker, in addition, $23.8 million went to the Transport Board with respect to its operating costs. And may I, at this point also, say how happy I am that elements of that operating costs have started to come down, particularly with the acquisition of the electric buses, which have obviously will not have the same type of requirements for maintenance, or indeed, obviously, the diesel that the previous older buses would need, and therefore the running costs and also the maintenance costs would be significantly lower. I believe that we took a decision in this year as well to purchase another 12 of those electric buses, which I anticipate will come by the middle of this calendar year. And I think that all of us who see them on the road feel proud to see them, and to know that Barbados is now the country in the Caribbean with the highest percentage of electric buses, thereby carrying us closer to our 2030 target of not contributing fossil fuels where we need not do so. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we've had also $5 million to the National Housing Corporation to help it meet some of its costs, while at the same time we know that, and the Minister, I believe, will speak during the course of this debate about the work that it has also been doing to allow us to move the persons who have been squatting, living without requisite permission at Rock Hall, but who we are committed to assisting in the move, largely because they are actually living dangerously so on a landfill that at any time you can have internal combustion. And we pray that it does not happen, but by the same token, we know that we need to do something about it, because no human being should be living on top of that landfill there or anywhere. And certainly not at this stage where the risk of internal combustion is still there. Mr. Speaker, at the Water Authority, there have been a number of improvements that we have seen by the ministry. And this ministry, Mr. Speaker, is moving full steam ahead. Let me deal with Transport and Works first before I deal with Water Authority. They have a lot of work to do, because very little work was done in a meaningful way that mattered to people. How many times did we hear people say that the roads in this country were contributing to them literally being in hock to the parts departments of companies all across Barbados? How many times? You're going everywhere and people talk about, I got to buy new shocks, I got to buy a new tire, I got to buy new rims. Why? Because we had a government that had so contorted and distorted the affairs of the country that it could not spend money to build roads, because it was spending 68 cents in every dollar of revenue in debt service. And that was the folly. And when we got up in this chamber, sitting where the Honourable Leader of the Opposition sits now, and we said year after year after year after year, restructure our debt and bring our people back to a sense of proper governance and proper capacity to do the things that a government must do to support its people. Dealing with sewage, dealing with the water, dealing with roads, dealing with supplies for schools, dealing with repairs to schools. All of these things were put on pause. Let us remember. And this government has come in and started to do them in a way that people almost cannot believe that things were not done for almost a decade. And now want to start and pass new judgments. But that's okay, because I get it. The only reason people can talk about some of the things that they want to talk about now is because we fixed the difficult things that were been humbugging them before. We have the luxury now of bringing back normal criticism to normal government operations, because we're no longer worrying about whether we will see sewage that is literally floating in the ocean and floating on the streets of this road outside here, outside this parliament, or shutting down apartments, not apartments, apartments too in fact, but also restaurants and other businesses. Mr. Speaker, this government can take criticism now from others, because we now have buses that can go to St. Joseph, and that can go to St. Andrew, and that can go to St. Philip and St. John all over. And with Wi-Fi and air conditioning, if you move. This government can take the handful of people who have nothing to do but to go on social media and distort and to create fake news. Because when all is said and done, we have garbage trucks now collecting people's garbage all about this country. And we're not satisfied even with that, so we're going to move to the next level of being able to ensure that the occupational health and safety of the SSA workers can be met by allowing the contraptions to be put on the trucks to lift the garbage bins, so that men don't have to hoist and haul and throw heavy bits of equipment into the back of a garbage truck. And more importantly, that we can also track the bins and track the trucks, so that we can improve the level of collection in this country and bring it to first world standards. Mr. Speaker, this government can take the criticism of people who want to create fake news, because when you go through St. John, you're seeing roads. When you go through St. Philip, you're seeing roads being done. When, not all yet, but we get in there. When you go through St. George, when you go through, the Deputy Speaker reminded me about Goodland. He don't want to be left out of the do. You understand? The Pine, same thing. In St. Michael South Central, Flagstaff Road that couldn't get finished under the last government, finished and now move on to other roads. Remember for St. Michael West Central, I'm told that he's logged in virtually. He should be here. He should be here not because he can't log in virtually, but because he and a member for Christchurch West and a member for St. Lucie and a member for St. John, all four of them shall share in the bounty of what will come to be regarded as the most productive period of road construction in this country since independence. Now, Mr. Speaker, we didn't ask for this, and the truth is I would have rather that we didn't have to put this on our record. But the only reason we have to put it on our record is because the last government did virtually nothing and waited to the very last minute. 6-9 months before the election, and then played at them scraping and literally going and putting on cover without building. I told MTW, don't do it again. Because this notion that you can scarify and just go and repave and leave drains not being done properly so that the water come and take up the same road again, it has to stop. And we have to recognize that if we have a climate crisis in a country, there are consequences. And part of the consequences is that you must redesign aspects of what you're doing, look at the engineering components again, and develop new models and new standards for how we build roads and how we deal with drains and drainage in this country. Mr. Speaker, I don't mind the criticism and the fake news. Because when the people go into Murphy pasture again, and the rain comes in the rainy season again this year, I pray that for the first time, those people down there, they have a huge wide canal. We're finished on that side. We're going across the road now to where the sewage plant is. And then we have to relocate. We had hoped to leave some of the houses there on the side of the canal. We're going to have to relocate a few of them within the city, nearby. But then when we relocate, we're going to have to landscape and properly deal with that area to make sure that those nobody is allowed to put back houses there such that they will be victims of flooding. Same with the airport at Rock Hall. The government has now to spend the money to acquire that land at Rock Hall in St. Philip and to extend the airport fence all the way up there, because nobody can go back and build on the landfill and put their lives at risk and put government's expenditure to pay for it. Must stop. So, Mr. Speaker, when we come now to this next fiscal year, where the government is hoping to collect revenue of 2.891 billion, and we're hoping to spend 3.398 billion, literally 3.2 billion being current expenditure, and roughly 193.4 million in capital expenditure. It is because we want to undertake these projects that I'm going to talk about now, because I don't intend to speak of 5 hours today or 4 hours. No, because there's too much to be done in Barbados for the luxury of that this year. Mr. Speaker, we will complete the IDB Global Roads project. That was perhaps one of the few projects the last government executed at the very last minute with CAF, and even then, as I said, there were difficulties in how they were executing, as was reflected in the Flagstaff Road to which I just referred. But we haven't stopped there, sir. We have settled, and I believe the contract went back to the Solicitor General on Friday, and I'm going to ask the Honourable Attorney General to make sure that we can get it back today, because the Complant Scotland District Road Rehabilitation Project is a key component over the next 3 years of what this government does. Mr. Speaker, the Scotland District represents 1/7 of our land area. And I'm tired speaking about the fact to which, they ignored down in there completely, and they ignored St. Thomas and St. Michael Northeast completely. So if you were in Jackson, you would know about Canewood Hill. That was stopped in 2007 January and never repaired until this government came back to office. If you live in Jackson, you will also know about Rockhampton Road, that the RDC started, was significantly through, but left once again for another 11 years, because 10 years after the government was out, and then we took another year almost, because we were literally trying to get our fiscal situation in order before we could go and resolve the issue. Mr. Speaker, these are some of the things that we have had to contend with, and hence we felt that it was important, especially since they knew, as Minister of Town Planning, one of the things that we had to find out was that they had paused all permissions in St. John, mind you, St. John, parts of St. Joseph, other parts of the Scotland District, because of the level of land degradation and the need to be able to stabilize the land more. That is why we, within the Capital Works project as well, started a Gabion construction project, not just to provide jobs for people as we went through this difficult period in the last year's one-off expenditure, but also because we need the Gabions to stabilize. And we're now being told that the Chinese may also bring an additional form of new engineering that may assist in the stabilization of the project. And I look forward to learning and hearing more on these matters when they come through. The member for St. John and others may speak to it. Mr. Speaker, that is why the member for St. Michael West Central, the minister, can speak definitively about the instructions that the cabinet has given for the people of White Hill to have their roads done. This government does not speak out of both sides of its mouth. When I said in opposition that White Hill will be done, it will be done. And it is being done as a priority under this Complant Scotland District Road Rehabilitation Project, along with the main highway, which, as we know, we even had tour companies refusing to send their buses down there because it is the closest experience to Disneyland that you can find in Barbados. Literally up and down, up and down, up and down, because of the way in which the road has been moving. Mr. Speaker, we also, however, have an aggressive community roads milling and paving program. The minister, I think, was entitled to do Long Gap, and I am carried along only by reason of being in the neighborhood. but he was entitled to do his own constituency in Long Gap, and that was done only as recent as this weekend. But there are a number of other roads that he literally has been milling and paving. The member for St. Michael Southeast spoke about the ones in the Pine. There are others that I've spoken about. Sorry? In Britain's Hill, the member for St. Michael South is reminding me, there's not a member of parliament in this chamber who can complain with real cause that the member for St. Michael West Central has not been proceeding with dispatch about the business of getting roads done in this country. Then there's the electronic vehicle registration system that will be rolled out in phases. The registration of vehicles commences in May with the ministry's vehicles, then all other government vehicles. And may I say at this point that the government for normal vehicles and cars made a decision last year that we will only buy electric vehicles going forward, because the government must lead by example with respect to meeting the 2030 target of a fossil fuel-free Barbados at best. Mr. Speaker, with the rollout of, after the rollout of the government vehicles, we expect the electronic vehicle registration system to then commence with all other vehicles privately owned in the country. The installation of the portals, that is the gantries, the cameras, both the speed and radio frequency identification tags, will begin in June of this year. The new vehicle database, the ministry has instructed us, will be completed by the end of July. So, Mr. Speaker, when I talked about the three objectives of these estimates, 1, protection of the vulnerable, 2, expansion of the public sector investment program to have public sector-led growth, and 3, the reality of trying to make business, doing business easier, and to do and reconstruct the things in this economy that need to be reconstructed so that we can be more competitive and that we can trigger growth and that we can have our private sector and our business people also benefited from greater levels of ease of doing business, but citizens also benefit from easier access to public services than they have traditionally been accustomed to. And you see it already. You saw it with the certificates of character. We know only too well that people used to have to wait 5 and 6 and 7 weeks to get a certificate of character to go for a job that a man can come for in 3 days' time. You're gone in 3 days' time and still can't get it because you're going to wait 5, 6, and 7 weeks. But now you can get it in 10 and 15 minutes, if not on the spot. Mr. Speaker, there's a new regime coming for liquor licenses in this year too. And all of these are things that this government, we have a new regime that will be coming for passports. All of these are things that this government is doing in order to digitize, but the anchor is the establishment of that verification and validation of your own identity digitally, every individual's identity digitally. And it has taken time to get it to this point, but it is critical that we do it, because once we do it, we are in a position now to do so much more digitally. And that is what the pandemic has forced us. This morning, much of the discussion in the African Ministers of Finance conference too settled around the importance of digitization in many instances to leapfrog areas of expenditure that you would otherwise have had to undertake. And the most perfect example for them in Africa was that they could leapfrog the building of a fixed line telecommunications network and go straight to mobile and mobile payments with what you call systems like M-Pesa and others that have now become global. We too are trying to encourage both local companies and the credit union movement in this area, because ultimately this is part and parcel of our future. And digital payments are as critical to us going forward as any other aspect of our architecture. And that is why this Honourable House would have passed legislation to govern a new national payment system in Barbados just a few weeks ago. I won't breach the rules of the House and reflect on it anymore, sir. Sir, we also, as it relates to the Water Authority, will see the strategic mains replacement continuing. And Mr. Speaker, you've heard me say over and over and over that we live in a country that has now to undertake the tremendous responsibility of replacing a main system that in many instances ranges from anywhere from 110 to 130 years old. And it's not just Barbados, it's almost every country in the Caribbean. The British government and the other colonizers put in the water pipes when they had empires. We have to replace it without an empire but with a country. And a country doing everything else while facing the existential crises of both COVID and climate and the difficulties that has imposed on us financially. We expect the Vineyard Water Augmentation Project to be completed this year and to provide the additional water to Golden Ridge and Castle Grant systems to improve the water distribution to the residents of St. John and the residents of St. Joseph. Mr. Speaker, we expect to upgrade the South Coast Sewage Treatment Plant as well as we promised the nation, and indeed we are in deep discussions, almost finished, I think, with the Chinese. The member for St. Michael South Central can speak along to that when she speaks to the Parliament, but we are virtually at the point where those contractual arrangements and funding arrangements have been put in place, and we expect over the course of the next 2 years, therefore, to see the replacement of the South Coast Sewage Treatment Plant, which has effectively outlived its usefulness. Mr. Speaker, you would recall that we would have placed a temporary outfall as well at Graham Hall to help deal with some of the immediate problems that we inherited when we came to government. Mr. Speaker, there is also a significant development, and I want to thank the former chairman of the Barbados Water Authority who would have put it in place. We are now in possession, I believe, of the codes at last, that are necessary in order to read the water meters accurately so as to protect the integrity of the revenue mechanisms of the Barbados Water Authority. I am told that the last receivers came in on the weekend by the couriers, and to that extent, Mr. Speaker, we will therefore ensure that for the first time we can literally put persons to drive by houses and to do the automatic reading that was always intended when that project was settled. But as you learned from the Auditor General's report, that information was never received, and those smart codes therefore could never have been put in place in order to be able for the Water Authority to properly collect it. I say so, Mr. Speaker, because the Attorney General would tell you that this was a highly, highly, highly contentious and litigious matter, and I'm happy, therefore, Mr. Speaker, that we are in a position now to put this behind us. And as I said, I thank the former chairman may have caused a lot of conversation, but at the end of the day, she did a wonderful job in being able to stabilize the Water Authority and being able to ensure that these things that were missing and the ability to regularize the integrity of its revenue collection can be put in place. I believe there is one other major matter that we are continuing to work on, but she will work on it with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, even though she has tendered a resignation, and we thank her for her time because she has indicated that she has other personal business which is now demanding her time on a full-time basis in her practice. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, I believe that the Barbados Water Authority has started the process of renegotiating the 2 desal plant contracts that we inherited from the last government. We intimated that those costs were out of our ballpark and that we could not afford to pay at those rates. And I look forward to renegotiated contracts that will allow us to see how best we can access desalinated water when needed, rather than taking large volumes on a take-or-pay contract and paying for water that we will not be taking or using in any time soon. And I thank not only the current team, but the previous minister, who would also have carried us a significant way to resolving a lot of these problems. I refer, of course, to the member for Christchurch East. Mr. Speaker, in addition to that, we expect in this year of our Lord to see significant work being done by the Ministry of International Business and Industry, in particular with the modernization of 2 critical departments, the International Business Unit, with the implementation of software systems there, and also the implementation of new software systems at the Corporate Affairs and Intellectual Property Office that will see them fully, the corporate registry being fully digitalized. Mr. Speaker, I truly hope that the digitalization will take place with the reconstruction, deconstruction and reconstruction of all of the rules of CAIPO, and I have confidence that the young management team there will help carry us in that direction, recognizing that the complaints against CAIPO have been too many and too long for us not to have this kind of serious strategic intervention, and it is coming at a significant cost, as I indicated with earlier, with $2.3 million. But I do believe that if we do that digitalization and we do the deconstruction and reconstruction and the customer service training, that we will see a year from now a far more efficient and effective CAIPO responding to the needs of all of its current tasks. And hopefully the kinds of complaints that would have seen people being rejected for the color of ink or different other things that were appearing to be unfortunate by those who had to use the registry, that there will be a thing of the past. I think that we're all agreed that we can, for what we call simple vanilla-like companies, that we can see a turnaround within hours. But for those that are more complex, obviously the lengths of times will be reviewed, and in partnership with some kind of monitoring mechanism. And I said to the minister, we need a monitoring mechanism to get the feedback to ensure that persons are not living in a bubble, but that they understand how their client class is being affected and how their client class would want to see things different. Mr. Speaker, the International Business Unit, as I said, will also be going through a program of new software. The Business Licensing Integrated Secure System is a natural extension of the Economic Substance System already implemented in the International Business Unit, and it will add new capabilities such as building a rich and secure portal to enable the competent authority, which is the IBU, and the corporate and trust service providers to apply, renew, and search the international business licenses for corporates, to create a standardized format and database, to protect the data and security principles of all parties, and to enable the capture of data related to business licensing workflows. We expect that there will be cost efficiencies gained through the digitization process, not just for government, but also for the corporate and trust service providers who use the system. There will be less printing of paper, and we've already done this in too many areas of government. I already indicated to the Parliament that, for example, we have a paperless cabinet now for over 2 years, and we have saved significant sums of money by trying to carry the country from an analog Barbados, 20th century Barbados, to a digital 21st century Barbados. Are we fully there yet? No, sir. But we've gone a long way towards making the difference and bringing us in fully to that 21st century. My view is that we will probably take another 2 to 3 years before we can get all of the services. But in addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we have also to take on the additional obligation of cybersecurity, which is absolutely critical for our brand if we are going to, and for our stability, if we are going to carry the country successfully through this transition. And therefore, there's a lot of expenditure that will also be spent in being able to bring about cybersecurity and to make all of our uses of the digital environment as secure as possible. I think even the Ministry of Education realized the risk that they face as they pursued the online teaching. And believe you me, this is as critical a role to be satisfied by the state as is the provision of normal policing and normal regulatory and security services. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the International Business Unit making these changes, and the Minister can speak about the benefits from the mining of the statistics or the enhanced security or the increased global competitiveness or the greater accessibility and availability of information to all. He can speak to all of those things when he gets up in this debate. suffice it to say that it is critical that we get this right, because as I told you when we reformed our corporation tax system, we could take decisions that would see us either, we had to literally harmonize the rate, and we could either go up or come down. And the question was, where are we going to see the quadrupling of business? Is it going to be in the domestic business sector? Is it going to be in those who do global business from Barbados, whether Bajan companies originally or international companies? Mr. Speaker, it was our view that Barbados must be a place from which global business can be conducted. And to that extent, all of these things have to be put in place so that there is a seamless capacity to conduct global business from this jurisdiction. When I met and asked the country on the 2nd of January 2020 for us to go on a 7-year journey to become world class, all of these were the things that we had in mind. But little did we know that we would have the biggest obstacle up front. But I am here to say that we have survived it. We've been bruised, for sure, but we have survived it. And we must now resume that path of making ourselves world-class by 2027. It's not going to be easy, because I think I've shown you that almost every area of social and economic endeavor in this country, every aspect of our governance, requires us to review where we are and stop living off of fumes. Fumes cannot propel the gas or give you gas to propel the car that you need to move. And we've said so over and over. But as is certain, every possible obstacle that we could think of has also been put in our way to test our character, to test our resilience. But as I've said, we are still standing, and we will continue that journey. Mr. Speaker, we also believe that the exposure of the heavy reliance on tourism has taught us a major lesson that we would want never to have any future set of Barbadians or government taught again. We have to diversify. We've said so over the years, successive governments, but regrettably, the extent to which we depended on tourism remains literally excessive. Mr. Speaker, this government has gone a significant way to build up the potential for a renewable energy industry, whether predominantly photovoltaic panels, some wind turbines, some discussion as to where in the mix we will have hydrogen or where we will have wave energy and other aspects. Where are we going to be able to use the benefits in the improvements of technology with batteries, and how will that assist? How can we use the renewable energy industry to be able to make agriculture more efficient and more cost effective and profitable, whether from the sugar industry or the livestock industry or the normal cultivation of plants? And in fact, my Ministry of Town Planning is looking at the kinds of conditionalities that we may put on some of the renewable energy applications, largely because we are in a situation where it is land intensive, especially the photovoltaic panels. And while we want to have as much renewable energy capacity as we need to, we do not want at any time to literally undermine what we must do to keep food security at the top of our mind, because that has been one of the lessons as well from COVID-19. Mercifully, as lead Prime Minister for the CARICOM Single Market and Single Economy, we have been the ones pushing the Caribbean private sector organization that has just been formed, and with whom we've now signed a headquarters agreement for their location in Barbados, to help the region deal with what we set as a 2025 target, but asking them now to bring it forward as much as possible. We had agreed that 25% of regional food imports would be replaced with regional food production by 2025. The region now spends about $5 billion a year in importing food. And whether it is Guyana and Suriname in the south, or Belize in the west, or Barbados going up the island chain right up to those countries that can do their little part, we felt that we needed to be able to have more production regionally and less foreign imports. And we now know, as a result of COVID, that one of the things that has been affected has not only been the whole issue of PPE and medicines and vaccines, but also that the disruption in the global supply chain and logistics chain has also affected access to certain types of food. And it is something that we have to continue to keep our eyes on, because, as I said, as long as the virus remains active globally, then it has the potential to disrupt that supply and those logistics, particularly of food. And we can't take any chances. But I go further. One of the reasons why we offered to host UNCTAD wasn't just about bringing people here, and I'll discuss that shortly, but it was fundamentally about being able to help shape the policy space. And you keep hearing me talk, Mr. Speaker, about shaping the fiscal space and shaping the policy space. Because, Mr. Speaker, we don't live on our own. We live in a world in which much of what we do is determined by global standards, global rules, global laws, treaties. And unless we can get in there and have a seat at the table, we can't influence the outcome. Can you believe that the developing world, and in particular small island developing states, have been arguing that vulnerability ought to be an appropriate criteria for determining who and from whom you can access concessional funds and at what price? And we've been arguing that for 30 years, 32 years, since 1989 in the Commonwealth Secretariat. Ironically, it was the father of my current advisor, Professor Prasad, who first literally put that there and was working on it. The then Prime Minister, who former member for St. Peter, led a whole framework for the Commonwealth small states. He then tried to pick it back up and to literally propel it, and it went nowhere. And regrettably, I'm not sure if the last Prime Minister did, but I'm sure that he would have tried. And regrettably, now Barbados and other nations find themselves having to pick it up again. Why? Because that is our reality. And the vulnerability came, bam, 90% decline in tourist arrivals. And this year of our Lord, between January and where we are up to last Friday, the number of tourists coming into Barbados, 6,000. Mr. Speaker, we can't do nothing with that. We can't do nothing with that. And that is why all of these consultations must now take place, and a determination as to what is the appropriate level of risk that we will take as a nation. Because I am here to tell you, sir, that the only place you can eliminate risk is on Mars or in the coffin. That's the only two places you can eliminate risk. On Mars or in the coffin. Thereafter, we're talking now about the management of risk and the mitigation, the reduction of risk. And therefore, we've tried to do that with a number of protocols that we have, but I'm not going to preempt because I have the tourism industry running me down. But I've said to them, I said we will have conversations, but not just with the owners of capital, that we must hear from the workers, we must hear from the stakeholders, we must hear from all of you, the water sports operators, the taxi drivers, the vendors, everybody who has a stake in the game. Because how and what we do to be able to build back this industry must be done with the social partnership, and the majority of us agreeing, because that is how we did it last year, that is how we brought it down, and we never shut the airports per se, but what we did was that we put protocols in place that we knew would lead to an automatic reduction in the number of travel and volume of travel and type of travel that we have. That is why, Mr. Speaker, this government stepped out of the temple of its familiar and introduced the concept of the welcome stamp in August last year, announcing it to the country in July and starting it in August last year. And the member for Christchurch East, when he speaks, I imagine, will update us on the figures with respect to the welcome stamp program. Of course, there have been some challenges recently, and in particular, as we've had to manage this last going down, but most of them have been sympathetic. And I think the biggest issue, as I've discussed with the Minister of Education, like with Barbadians, is when will school resume for the majority of us? When will we also be able to deal with other aspects of economic activity? We've brought back in the retail sector for the most part. We will have, in my view, things that relate to enjoyment and the other things. I saw that my colleague Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves would have indicated to his population that if they wanted Carnival, that they should take the jab. Now, I'm not going to say that to get a joke, you have to take a jab. But suffice it to say that I understand what might have motivated him. And I say so conscious that, look, let us deal as always with our needs before we deal with our wants. And this government has been very, very consistent in that respect. And to that extent, we are facilitating the movement of persons for the moment while we continue to do the things necessary to protect the population as far as possible, but we're doing it in the context of work. We understand the challenges faced by churches and other types of entertainment and other types of activities, some of which are entertainment, some of which are not entertainment but service club oriented. Those are things that we want to do. They're highly desirable, and in the case of the church, they're essential, but the church has found ways of streaming because of the technology for the most part. But we accept that the more people we vaccinate in this population, the more people are willing to take the chances and to take the risk, because there's been a significant reduction in the exposure to risk of death or risk of severe hospitalization. And only as I speak, another study came out of the United States of America this morning, which both the Financial Times and the Guardian published for AstraZeneca, that shows roughly 79% efficacy with respect to its benefits as a vaccine. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm saying all of that to make the point that we need to be able to diversify the economy. We need to get tourism, yes, functioning again, and we'll come to that, and I hope that those consultations, as I said, will have started. I'm also consulting with the Ministry of Health officials and others and the University of the West Indies to hear their perspectives, so that over the course of the next week, 10 days, we need to be able to settle a roadmap for this country, so that those people who want to do business with Barbados, who want to come to Barbados, who want to engage with us, can have clarity as to when we think we will be in a position to do it again, bearing in mind the fragile state of our fiscal circumstances. We feel, however, and a proposal was made to us for the establishment of a Barbados-free zone, and I look forward to that proposal coming to Cabinet shortly, and also its legislation coming to Parliament, because we need to be able to attract foreign direct investment again here, not just in the things that traditionally have done so in recent times, like tourism, and in more recent times, renewable energy, and in some instances, medicinal cannabis. But we need to get some foreign direct investment again in traditional manufacturing, and in also new areas of biotechnology and biogenetic engineering. You heard the Honourable Minister of Health speak to the fact that a supplementary will come to this Honourable Chamber tomorrow that will allow us to make the investment in the labs through a special purpose vehicle that we will form, to be able to deal with our capacity to do the genetic tracing of the various variants. But we don't want to stop there for COVID, because we recognize that a lot of the machines and a lot of the capacity can be built out to do a wider range of things. And Barbados has been lucky that we have a number of persons who are available globally as Bajans who have worked in these areas and therefore can assist the government and the lab more so than the government in being able to build up its capacity significantly. And for us to look at a biotechnology industry and biogenetic engineering as possibilities, not just for employment for our people, but also as means of earning to be able to engage globally at a different level. Mr. Speaker, I have told the country that I chair the One Health Global Initiative with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh for the WHO, the FAO, the United Nations Environmental Programme, and the organization that deals with plant wellness, livestock wellness. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is that antimicrobial resistance that we are focusing on, and I'm sure the member for St. Philip North can speak to it at length, or the member for Christchurch West, relates to something that we have come now to call the slow motion pandemic, because it threatens, Mr. Speaker, to reverse a century of medical progress. We go to the dentist and we don't think twice about going to the dentist or the risk of infection. People have babies and they really don't worry about infections in the same way that they did before we were able to reduce maternal mortality and the various other things that a century of medical progress has brought for us since the development of antibiotics and penicillin, etc. But yet, what most people don't know is that people are using a lot of these products to raise livestock, or a lot of them in the management of plants and fruit. And when you realize the extent to which there is this over-reliance on antibiotics, you now better understand that in the absence of significant research as well, what you have is a situation where our bodies are resisting and we are not able to fight off the superviruses that exist particularly in hospitals, that emerge in hospitals, and that's why you see so many people dying from hospital-aided infections across the world. Mr. Speaker, it is a serious issue, and that is why this country, small as it is, must continue to produce the kinds of persons and continue to attract the kinds of economic activity that are allied, in my view, to medical services, to educational services, to business and financial services, to the creative economy, and at the same time to look at substantive investments in areas of renewable energy to reduce our imports of fossil fuels, and at the same time to look and see how best we can develop our own domestic industry, but in a way that is consistent with the targets and the objectives that we've set. Similarly with medicinal cannabis, and let me say this for the record, the government of Barbados in these two new sectors have determined that we must create opportunities for Barbadian investment. When I say that we are not prepared to literally allow only others to come in to make money, I mean it. The cabinet took a decision that 30% of any application for renewable energy ought to be owned by locals. And similarly for medicinal cannabis. But we go further. We will provide, and we've said it all along, that the 30% is the floor, not the ceiling. And therefore, there are Barbadians who will come on their own for the renewable energy licenses. There are Barbadians who will come on their own for medicinal cannabis licenses. But because I do not want us to start where the previous colonizers started, and to preserve inequity by having available opportunity, because you know, when 1945 came in the world, while it gave us all of the glorious opportunities and ideas in the Charter that essentially became the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, that Charter, in preserving opportunity and protection, also fixed it in the absence of an affirmative action program, in the absence of a Marshall Plan type program for the colonies, in the absence of a reparations type program. And people don't like the word, and I understand why, but the bottom line is that you compensated owners of capital who own slaves, but you refused to compensate the fact that the country from which you extracted decades and decades and decades of wealth was left to fight the development trajectory on its own with little or nothing other than physical assets remaining in country. It's wrong. We all know it is wrong. And we all know it does not meet the best standards of morality. But, Mr. Speaker, we can't equally, while knowing it is wrong, lie down and cry and pretend that the world can just go past and let us on. Perhaps, as a woman, I know that how much ever you complain that you ain't got enough food in the house, you still got to feed the children the way you got. They've got to be a person of practical affairs. And therefore, we have said, look, that there are persons who may want to invest in medicinal cannabis, and some among the Rastafarian community who we all know have paid the ultimate price for the deprivation of liberty, and in some instances in the region, I suspect, the loss of life, for defending their rights for something that was legal before, 100 years ago, and that may well become legal again. Now, we have chosen to go a measured step-by-step way in this country because that is who we are. And there are people who say yes, and there are people who say no, and we've said as a government, it's a wedge issue, we will talk with you. But what is not a wedge issue is the scientific results pertaining to medicinal cannabis. And we're satisfied that because the structure of the industry is different. For instance, most people growing medicinal cannabis don't do it in open field, although some will. Similarly, that depends, you need to be trained in the agronomy that is necessary for you to grow the different strains and to know what is good for anxiety as opposed to what may be good for some other medical condition. All of these things require training as well as quality assurance. And therefore, what I've said to the Minister of Agriculture is without prejudice to all that you have done, the government is going to have to find a mechanism for persons to do a joint venture investment with those Barbadians who need either training and or initial capital in order to allow us to get them to a certain stage with a recognition that they can buy us back out in 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, depending on the length of time that they take to do it. Clearly, we cannot do it for everybody. And there's a defining limit anyhow as to what percentage of our acreage can be deployed in this respect, because we have to grow food for people to eat as well. And therefore, there has to be a balance. But suffice it to say that the government has heard you. And the government hasn't only heard you, the government perhaps could have done a better job in explaining to you what its plans were from before, because from the very beginning we have said 30% in medicinal cannabis is literally the floor and not the ceiling. And therefore we expect that there will be some levels of foreign investment to amplify with the savings that we have here locally to allow us to see an expansion and a flourishment of these sectors. I maintain that we are better off if we can see some level of vertical integration, especially in the early stages, until the world finds more efficient and effective ways of managing cross-border trading, especially with the financial arrangements, than it currently does. And I think that that is going to require more detailed discussions, particularly with the Canadian banks, 3 of whom are already present here. And rather than forwarding payments through the United States of America, where there is still not the federal framework for you to do so legally, then we will have to look at dedicated usage of the markets, of the banking arrangements with Canada, rather than going through the United States any form or part of the equation. If we can get the free zone going, on top of getting the renewable energy sector going, and I believe the minister will make a ministerial statement next Monday when we come back after consultations that he's been having with the sector, with the Fair Trading Commission, to be able to unlock that part of the industry. I'm told that there are also some technical issues that have to be resolved with respect to some of the smaller plants that have gone in, and that the Light and Power has some technical issues with what is immediately available or not, and that has to be resolved, and I hope the minister will address that, or the framework for how it will be addressed when he addresses this Honourable Chamber next Monday morning. But if we can get those things going, Mr. Speaker, we can see a pathway. And when I talk about educational tourism, all the talk, Ross University has been back here for the last, 3 months? Since the beginning of January? And the bottom line is that while we talk about long-stay tourism, whether it is the welcome stamp, whether it is educational tourism, whether it is medical tourism, whether it is international business and financial services, what we are effectively doing is trying to expand the numbers of persons who come to work every day to produce to purchase goods and services. And we saw it clear last year when we had the first lockdown with the tourists not coming. The Minister of Agriculture told us we had a glut with pork and with chickens, because all of a sudden, instead of feeding X plus Y number of people, we were feeding X number of people. And Mr. Speaker, it drove home the point even more that we needed to be able to have more long-stay tourism. But long-stay tourists can only come if people have access to income, which means that they have to be working in jobs that allows them to be either a digital nomad, working remotely, or they've got to have a lot of money that they don't need to work for nobody when they come for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 months, 4 weeks. That's our reality. Until we can get sufficient people vaccinated, that we can manage the risk, and that is what the next 2 weeks will be about with respect to how we deal with that, both pre-herd immunity and post-herd immunity. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we also have to look at those other sectors. The other productive sector, and ironically, Dr. Maskell, former member for St. Michael Northwest, would have, along with another former member for St. Michael South Central, Sir Richard Haynes, would have maintained in and out of this chamber that the construction industry in Barbados is really a productive sector. And to that extent, what we do to stimulate construction, whether it is in the rejuvenation of derelict government buildings, whether it is in the establishment of a housing program, which we have come to call the Hope Direct, and equally the Hope Premium program, which is intended to go at a higher level for persons earning above 4,000. Hope Direct is for 4,000 and under. But what we have to do is to get as much construction going, whether it is through the civil works on roads or water mains being laid. This country is going to go through a massive exercise of reconstruction and construction, restructuring of institutions, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, a repurposing of a lot of what we see happening in our institutions to make it more appropriate, particularly in the context of the digitization that we will be using to take place, but also in relation to those things that we need to just reconstruct because the rules are arcane and inappropriate, as has happened with the 19th century police force, or that happens with the 19th century psychiatric hospital, or that happens with other institutions that are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old that need to be repurposed for this. And then finally, we will see an explosion in retraining. That's the only way. That's the only way we can reset and stop believing that the fumes from the gas tank will carry us any further. The fumes were gone. We got a gas tank, and then we realized that there's a leak in the tank still, which is what COVID is. And we therefore have to pause, fix the leak, and then fill back up the tank to move again. And in filling up the tank to move again, we're going to see a massive explosion in construction and reconstruction with all the derelict buildings. We need to see a massive program of retraining, because how we relate to our jobs, what we can do, how we relate to each other in our jobs, to recognize that we can disagree without being disagreeable, that we can do a whole host of things to boost productivity in a more effective way. We want to be able to have the digital citizenship module of the National Training Initiative done by every student, ultimately in primary and secondary school, and every adult, particularly those, and we can't force you unless you want to access certain government services. It takes little or no time to do. But what it does is that it assures us that you have been exposed or learned what matters in the building of this nation. Why there must be a commitment to excellence. Why there must be a commitment to honesty, transparency, fairness, tolerance, listening to people, not shutting them down. All of the things that are necessary to make how we deliver goods and services more efficient, and to bring credit to our nation by our living, by how we practice what we do, by how we relate to each other. and that by so doing, that we hope it will spill over as people interact in their personal lives with their siblings and their partners and with their children and their parents and grandparents. Because at the end of the day, the training and retraining that we want has to be rooted. So that, Mr. Speaker, you see in these estimates a continued approach towards transformation through training and reconstruction. And that is why when the Minister of Housing speaks again, he'll talk to you about the Civil Works program and the extent to which we want to deal with construction. But the minister in the Ministry of Town Planning, the member for St. Michael South Central, who does the day-to-day management for me, will also speak to you about the extent to which our use of planning arrangements through it, both in terms of substantive planning applications as well as in planning gains agreements that we are putting on the table, that we are in a position to see more and more economic activity. Mr. Speaker, I hear a lot of talk, You forget that even when we restructured the debt, we never touched the savings bonds that the last government lured Bajans into buying at rates of 2.5% and 3% when you were only getting 0.01% in the bank accounts. We didn't touch it. And even when we restructured the other debt that pensioners may have had, remember we came back immediately and gave back people $50,000 in cash and then gave them bonds going up to $250,000 and then strip bonds to pay them every year. Mr. Speaker, the BOSS program that was done in this last year, we have seen a large number of public servants and then some institutional investors as well as some private people buying from public servants continue to buy bonds at the rate of about $4.5 million a month. The member for Christchurch East Central can give you the report when he speaks. The bottom line is that this has been a government through CLICO, through British American, through the bonds, through everything that we've put money back into people's hands. And if ever they needed money, it was to get through this last 12 months in this country. So that when I say thank God for this government, I'm not only saying it with respect to the macroeconomic stability that we've still been able to hold a line with against the backdrop of the worst global recession in almost 100 years, worse than World War II, they all agree now. And we're standing. We're bruised, but we're standing. And I ask the people of this nation to walk with us still, because there's a lot of work we want to do. The Minister for Home Affairs is fighting, trying to bring into the 21st century institutional arrangements for our criminal justice system, particularly for juveniles that have been around for more, regrettably, for more time than we hope to recall, Victorian in nature. But it takes time to change it. The Cabinet has had before it a child justice bill looking at a child protection bill. UNICEF has been asked to come in and assist. But at the same time, I wish we had the fiscal space to do that which I wanted to do as Minister of Education from as far back as the year 2000, to build the next step to Alma Paris. That we were to have built 2 more secondary schools like Alma Paris, capped at 300-400, dealing with children scoring under 30% in the common entrance. But I couldn't do that while I can't even get the children home without buses, or the children, parents home, or to work, or the sewage, or the sanitation, garbage trucks that could lead to a public health disorder. I wish that we were back earning enough and growing enough that the next natural stage beyond the 2 schools, one in the south in St. Philip, Christchurch, St. John N, and one in St. Michael, that in addition to them, that we could go to the next step, which is how do we take those troublesome kids that the school system really can't deal with, and bring them into a ward-like program of a residential type program, not at Dodds or government industrial school, but before they get to that point, but after they've started to have some suspensions and went to the Edna Nichols school that can only keep them for a few weeks. I brought that legislation in here as Minister of Education, and it was always intended that the next step would be to have a residential type facility, because we all know that there are some parents who cannot manage whatever and however they try, and that very often, whether it is through the Child Care Board or whether it would have to be through an arrangement with the courts, to take those kids and just try and work with them, not in a penal-like, Victorian-like institution. And that's where we want to go. But there are persons who seem to have forgotten that what we are doing is climbing out of a 40-foot hole. All because we have made it look so seamless and so relatively easy. Mr. Speaker, the gray hair here to show you that it has not been easy. But equally, not that nor anything else will daunt us and remove us from the task of completing that which we promised. And when I say we, I include the Leader of the Opposition, because he helped promise at the same time as us. I noticed today he's wearing maroon. And I said to him that maroon is a combination of blue and red, but it has a greater hue towards red than to blue. The point is that he too, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition and myself both know from which point this country came. And I get it, and he has to keep us on our toes. And that's why, unlike a lot of others, I don't get vexed with him. I may tangle with him, I may engage with him, but I don't get vexed with him. Because even before he became the Leader of the Opposition, as this cabinet was sworn in on Bay Street, I said to the country then that I would play that role if I have to. And ministers, if they are fully frank with you when they get up, will tell you that this government is the hardest on itself. And why? Because we want to perform, because we feel the people of Barbados deserve it, because we feel the people of Barbados have been taken too deep into a hole, and that only to find out as you're trying to come out of that hole, that outside bleak, 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 and the rain coming down and won't push us back in the hole. That's what we feel. But not even that bad weather, not even that pandemic gonna hold us down. And that is why, as we go from ministry to ministry, we have to find things that focus not just on the immediate, but the strategic. So the Minister of Home Affairs will bring a new immigration bill in this next fiscal year that will allow us to treat to the fact that the National Population Commission, as I've said over and over, and I'm not sure if the report has been laid in this Parliament, and if it hasn't, I'm asking the member for St. Michael South Central to please lay it, that has shown that we have not replaced our population since 1980. When the late Tom Adams was Prime Minister of this country, he would have had the benefit in relation to the country that he was managing, a larger and better hand with respect to the numbers of persons living and coming to work than I do today, 40 years later. And the numbers are there. That if you were only simply to have replaced your population, Barbados should have 80 to 100,000 people more in this year, 2021, than we have. That we should be closer to 400,000 people than we are to 300,000. And that is why we have to take it seriously. The report also says that in less than 13 years, 14 years, our labor force will be smaller than it is now. And all of us in here who are relying on the level of contributions to sustain the Social Security system must also be concerned and ensure that we get this right. And in getting it right, we need to make sure that we do not alter the essence of who we are as a people, but at the same time recognize that you cannot get blood from a stone. And that is why our growth for the last 20 years has been as anemic as it has been, separate from the malfeasance and the misfeasance and them other things too. That there was a structural issue that continues to bedevil us. And the time for real conversation has now hit us. So we expect the Minister of Home Affairs to bring that. Similarly, the Minister of Home Affairs is presiding over the construction of a new fire station headquarters that we expect to start during the course of this year too. And I think the country was briefed on that when we moved the fire station from town. And why? Because at the end of the day, the essence of who we are is always represented in a capital city. And this government has chosen that those two things, apart from the tourism that we will bring clearly with the most magnificent beach in the Eastern Caribbean being available to us in Carlisle Bay, that it is not sufficient to just treat to what will earn the money, but we have to treat to what will keep the soul together. How does a country have a location like Golden Square, and 9 out of every 10 Bajans don't know what Golden Square is and where it is? Don't know that it is the place from which our modern democracy sprung. Know that without that, there would be no Barbados Labour Party. There would be no national hero called Sir Grantley Herbert Adams. There would be no Democratic Labour Party because that sprung from the Barbados Labour Party. And that the battles that we fought politically in order to be able to bring our nation whole, to be able to correct the excesses of 3 centuries of colonialism and exploitation and deprivation and oppression and tyranny and murder could be put behind us. And we have no proper representation of it in this country, and that we were left to only the vagaries of Nelson's statue in the middle of National Hero Square to define us? No, not from the children of independence of this nation. Those men on both sides of the aisle fought too hard, and they would believe that we would have learned nothing from them if we did not make these investments, these one-off investments. And why are we in a position to do one-off investments and not do the school down the road? Because the school is recurring expenditure. The one-off investment allows us to meet the demands of the moment, help people live, build capacity, or do whatever we're doing and move on. And if I can make one critical point, the mistake made by the last government when it faced the global financial crisis, a crisis that now looks like child's play in comparison to what the pandemic has done to the world. The mistake that they made was that they sought to create the loss of that private economic activity in the private economy with recurring expenditure. They just hired and just left people on so that even when the economy was coming back, had it been one-off expenditure that they were engaged in, by 2010, 2011, 2012, that one-off expenditure would have gone. And therefore, there would not be the persistent rising deficits that led to the increase in debt that the country was forced to carry over the course of the majority of that decade. Mr. Speaker, this government could go and open a school like I want to open. I really want to open it. And the member for St. Michael Southeast knows that, because we know that we have to finish those two Alma Paris type schools, reopen Alma Paris, that the last government just shut down on children, 30% and under. And then we need to find that institution that carries the children who need to go in between Edna Nichols and before you get to the government industrial school. It is critical if we are to save our children. But we can't do it until we can grow our economy such that it can continue to take that kind of recurring expenditure as opposed to the one-off expenditure that I'm referring to. And believe you me, the one-off expenditure will help us to deal with a lot of the construction deficit that the country has had, especially in the public space, for the better part of the last few years. As I said, the Child Protection Bill will come. We will also expect that even with the establishment of the new fire service headquarters, that there will be a closer and better integration with the response times between the fire service and the emergency ambulance service working together, not just the official ones, but the private ones. We hope to be able to ensure that there's a whole-of-nation approach towards emergency management in this country. In the Ministry of Agriculture, the feed program, which caters to more than 1,000 persons. I had a long session with the member for St. Lucie on Friday evening, and I'm satisfied that the work there is continuing. The member for St. Philip South also has literally been on top of the issue of us dealing with some of the structural problems that have bedeviled agriculture for too long. When they took me and showed me the need for greater supplies of water, that's why we supported the supplementary here that would allow them to have expanded access to irrigation, not just in Spring Hall, not just at River, and we need to deal with the 3 Houses Act and the madness that continues to masquerade is being done under that legislation. It has to be dealt with, especially since we tried to do it cooperatively, and there seems to be a return to the kind of restrictive practices that would harm the farmers in that area. And therefore, we need to look at all of the pieces of legislation that govern water in this country, from the 3 Houses Spring Act to the Pori Spring Act, as well as to the national framework for it. We recognize that Barbados has developed practices, even as one of the 15 most water-scarce countries in the world to have developed, that are not in its national interest. And that is that we allow people to extract water from private wells in manners that we can't properly control, or we're not properly being compensated. And those things have to change. If not, there will be no sustainable development in this country as we go forward. These are the conversations that we will have in this year of our Lord. We will also be looking at the issue of pensions, because we cannot continue having a system that is defined in the way in which it is through the benefits that people get. We are contributing. Most people don't contribute to their own public sector pension. We have to have that conversation going forward, because it is not sustainable, the rate at which pensions is growing in the country. We will take care of existing people, don't get me wrong, so don't let nobody go and put out no fake news for any of you. But I got to start thinking not just about today, but 20 years and 30 years down the line. In 1981, Sir Louis Tull, former member for St. George South, brought in this honourable chamber a bill for a new Education Act that changed the person who was employing teachers in this country at secondary level from boards of governors. You remember that name? That phrase, boards of governors, to the Ministry of Education. And there was a lot of a hullabaloo and a lot of noise and everything, and he made the point, we are grandfathering. We're not changing the terms and conditions of people who are there, but we are going to hire people under new terms and conditions. Only 2 weeks ago, the ministry informed me that effectively almost everybody who was previously employed under the Board of Governors situation has gone. And therefore, the wisdom of a Barbados Labour Party government taking people and running a parallel system so as not to disrupt the rights of the contractual rights and obligations of those teachers hired by the Board of Governors, with the new ones coming in and the Ministry of Education, where the ministry could have the flexibility to transfer teachers from one secondary school to another secondary school to another, which makes sense. Because, of course, you have to be able to get your best return on how you deploy your teaching resources in a country. So, Mr. Speaker, that work on pensions equally will have to have a dual track, those who are here and those who are to come. But no country in today's world, don't even fool yourself, can get by without having persons contribute something to their pensions if it is to be sustainable. And that is why we want to have a situation that allows us to address it. Truth is, had it not been for COVID, we probably would have been addressing it since late last year, but not at this stage. The water augmentation program in agriculture will continue. We have to get on top the whole issue of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and I've told the minister, we do not need to wait for a big fancy lab, which the other government, the last government, actually literally threw in the wastebasket, because we left an IDB project to be able to bring that lab and the new legislation and all of the other measures in place. And I've said to him, bring the legislation, bring the measures, and we will go on piece by piece by piece, but we have to get to the point where we can have these measures in place, the SPS measures, so that Barbadian farmers and fishermen can export without the kinds of difficulties that they would otherwise face with it. Predial larceny, we've given permission for the Ministry of Agriculture as well as the police to be able to use technology to better protect the investments of property owners and farmers in what they have, recognizing that drones and other forms of technology can give us access to tools that we would not otherwise have had, and we would have never had sufficient people to deploy to be able to minimize the threats there. With respect to the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Blue Economy, we want to continue to improve the conditions for all fisherfolk by completing the repairs to the Oystons and Bridgetown jetties, and for the total upgrade eventually to the haul-out facility at Concept Bay. We are conscious that it may have to spread 2 fiscal years once again because of the dislocation on our revenue caused by the pandemic, but we are starting. Similarly, what we are not spreading over 2 years was the purchase and acquisition of the 18 fishing aggregating devices, FADs as they're called, so as to be able to allow the fish to gather. And instead of fishermen having to spend much more money on diesel to go much more distance to get fish, we hopefully will be able to allow them to catch the fish within our territorial waters and definitely within our EEZ, such that they will be in a position to spend less money, we hope, on diesel in order to be able to bring back the catch into land that they are. We want to see a continued expansion of the exports. Bajans know that very quietly we have been exporting for years tuna, and we feel that we can move to the next level and continue to see a more developed fishing industry. At the same time, I spoke in opposition, and I'm happy that we're finally getting there on a lease-to-own program for some of our fishermen who really can't go in any bank in Bridgetown or any credit union in Bridgetown and easily borrow money to purchase a boat. But we feel that through construction and through partnership that we're in a position also to lease, and we're going to start that program. And once again, we will see that go into future fiscal years, future financial years, such that we can meet the demand more and more with our partners. Mr. Speaker, one of the difficult things to explain to this country is that we had hoped to have a debt for nature swap to protect our marine area and to develop a marine conservation area. And the minister cannot wait anymore on it because, regrettably, the confidence of which I spoke earlier has meant that our bonds have been trading far higher than we ever expected them to trade. And as a result, there is not the differential in pricing that would have been otherwise there had our bonds performed like most other restructured bonds. Regrettably, therefore, we've got to find another mechanism to be able to deal with the marine spatial planning and marine conservation that we need. And you know, we take a lot of things for granted, but I've said that Public Affairs Division has to be able to start educating. And that's why it's been created, because there's some practices that we have as a nation to move away from. We eat chubs. I love chubs. I like them bad too. But chubs eat at the sand. And basically and they help populate the sand back for our beaches. So every time you eat chubs, you are literally taken away from the sand that should be going to build back up our beaches. And I think the figure, I don't want to speak out of turn, because I keep telling people I didn't do a lot of science at school because I had 7 science teachers in the 2 years in first and third form. And I think that helped turn me off of it. So I'm learning science as I go along, which is why I love. Where's my friend, the member for Christchurch West Central, who has become our scientific advisor in chief in cabinet. And I think the people of Barbados got a piece of it last week as he addressed his responsibilities in the ministry. But I think it is £5 a year that for every chub that you take out of the sea, you're literally robbing the beach of 5 pounds of sand over a 12-month period. And it therefore means that we have to have the conversations with our fishermen. It has happened in Grenada and Jamaica and elsewhere, where they've been able to change the manner in which they fish. Some of you on a Sunday morning, if you're at the beach, you may see a boat a little bigger than a Moses going down with 10 and 12 fellas in the boat, not during COVID now, of course, but before. And they would have these long, huge nets, and the nets are thrown out and literally are taken. But they're doing the worst damage to our reefs and things. So that all of these things would have been done properly in the rollout of the Marine Conservation Plan and in the rollout of the training that has gone with it. Because our bonds are doing so well, Mr. Speaker, we can no longer rely on that for funding this plan. And therefore, the Minister is going to have to come with a new framework to deal with it. He will also have to liaise with all involved, the fishermen, the persons who rely on the beach, because they've got a lot of people who rely on the beach but are not necessarily full-time fishermen, the scientists, the marine biologists, and to see how we can come together to literally protect our coastal waters and our reefs going forward. And that's why the government has chosen its major capital program to still be the Roofs to Reefs program. Because if a hurricane hits us tomorrow, regrettably, Mr. Speaker, because of the manner in which we rebuilt our houses after Hurricane Janet, we will end up with having literally too many, too many house roofs being affected because of these flat roofs that we have come to make the norm, to be the norm in construction on chattel houses in Barbados. We need the gables again. We need the hip roofs. We need to tie down the straps. All of our new housing designs have been done with a view to ensure that they can be resilient and withstand that kind of, those kinds of winds. And the truth is that we need to find ways of benefiting from it as we go forward by rebuilding and refurbishing the existing housing stock. But as you know, when you go to refurbish, as I said earlier, you may find that you can't just refurbish without removing uprights and without removing siding boards and without doing X, Y, Z, so that invariably the cost is greater. Similarly, when we look, and I heard persons talking here last week about the whole question of reducing and rebuilding up in the Pine. We can't afford to rebuild our whole housing estates just so. And it is an exercise in fancy to believe that we can just change out everything with what? But what we are doing is making sure that the new places that we build conform to these new standards, and that where we have to go back and refurbish or reconstruct, that they also conform with the standards, and that where we can reduce the density of persons living in housing areas, largely because there are too many people living in too small spaces. And therefore, we need to be able to make sure that we can have an aggressive program that is premised not on government's balance sheet alone, but is premised also on government using its enabling and empowering powers to be able to put people together with people who have access to mortgages in order to be able to purchase their own properties. So I say that to say to you that you'll probably find a multidisciplinary approach to the provision of housing in this country. People who will buy genuinely from the private sector, and there are a number of major private developments going on at different levels. People who will buy from Hope Direct because invariably they are earning $4,000 and less, and therefore what we've tried to do is to be able to reduce the cost of capital, reduce the cost of land, reduce the cost of construction, and reduce the cost of the development of services, so that by having 4 different reductions coming from different angles, that you make housing more affordable for the average policeman, the average teacher, the average nurse, especially single parents in this country who do not have a second income coming in. And where do we give them the opportunity for the second income? By putting the photovoltaic panels on their house and allowing them to assign the revenue benefits such that they do not even have to pay a cent then for the purchase of the land, because the value of the land has been taken care of by the revenue to come over the 15 years from the photovoltaic panels on the roof of the land. That is how this government is trying to make it affordable for ordinary people to have housing in this country. And it has taken a little longer than we wanted, because it has many different components literally coming together in order to be able to allow people who would not otherwise qualify for mortgages to be able to do so. But we've gone further. I said to the Minister of Housing, those houses remaining at River and elsewhere that have been unoccupied for years. Remember the last government left a whole set of houses unoccupied, Mr. Speaker? You used to live in St. Philip at one point, so you should know them well. And then also others. What we have said is that rather than trying to fix it up fully and do all of those things, discount it heavily and sell it to single parents who invariably can get their families to help do some of the repairs. But when you have dropped the price by about $65,000, there's more than enough in there for them to buy what has to be bought and to get their families to fix it up, rather than leaving these houses empty and then having the situation of single parents fighting to find somewhere to live in this country and being thrown out. I feel the Barbados Society for Vagrants and Homeless People, they're under pressure all the time. Under pressure all the time. And it is largely because of the level of lack of jobs in the country, because of what we're going through at this point in time. So, Mr. Speaker, believe you me when I say that there has to be multiple approaches. The minister can't get a lot of money on budget because things are tight, but he's building 1 or 2 quads. And then the other thing that we will examine is looking to see whether, with strategic partners from overseas in particular, whether we can't encourage them. Previously, we would have had the Venezuelans do a housing project in Barbados many years ago. I don't know whether there are other companies interested in doing lower or lower middle income housing, but we will also find out and put the people directly in contact so that government's balance sheet is not affected, other than perhaps maybe a small subsidy on what they may need to pay or put in place to access a 20 or 25 or 30-year mortgage. But that is the approach of this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to come home soon because I'm speaking far longer than I intended to. And believe you me, it is because this government, ministry by ministry by ministry by ministry, has so much to do. Mr. Speaker, I believe that Queen's Park needs to be redeveloped for the people of this country. And it must be the home for cultural and creative activity in Barbados, because it is central. Because when those kids are coming from school, or when people are in town and the parents in town, there must be a place where they can go and see people rehearsing and dancing, people painting and doing all kinds of fine arts in a little corner of it, people rehearsing music and doing whatever they have to do. And to that extent, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the next 2 years, we want to be able to see, we want to relocate the headquarters of the National Cultural Foundation back down to town, but we also want to build out different performing and other spaces. There's a part right below the theater, going back to where you are with Spartans playing field. That is a little amphitheater, for example, that would be perfect for people to go and speak on any day and to have all kinds of activities. Most people don't know that Marcus Messiah Garvey was there, and that part of the garden should be renamed after Marcus Messiah Garvey in pursuit of allowing those who want to offer opinions, almost like Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, to be able to go there and just speak. Similarly, we want to be able to make sure that it's not a derelict place. You're going there and the pond ain't working. I mean, all kinds of things. We've almost become accustomed to things looking popped down, and it must stop. And that's why you hear me say to the member, the Minister of Environment and National Beautification, and the Minister of Public Works, Barbados must be cleaned up. And with the shutdown, the lockdown, the pause, we have allowed, obviously, things to get back up, grass growing back up and things, and you're going into the dry season now. Let us as a nation, Mr. Speaker, agree that between now and May Day, between now and the Workers' Day, that we are going to do all within our power to clean up around us. Clean up around you privately, clean up around you in front of your yard publicly. Clean up all around. There was a time when people would take their own things and remove all of the dust and silt in front of the yard, in front of their house, in the gutter. And I keep making the point, and I've asked MTW to look at acquiring more street rollers, because grass can't grow to concrete. So grass only grows when silt and dirt are left to accumulate there in the gutters. I don't want to be one of the few people in this country fighting this battle. And I'm asking all Bajans, please, we know better. We've done better. And we can take care of everything around us, including sometimes land that belongs to a neighbor who won't do it. Because at the end of the day, the neighbor living in foreign, and at the end of the day, the rat's living at you. It can't work. Now, in fairness, the Attorney General will bring the legislative framework, and the member for Christchurch West Central spoke about it. But I defend the AG because, as I said, the last year has been crazy in terms of all that we've had to do and to displace normal programming in order to be able to get through this awful pandemic. But I really, really want to appeal to Barbadians. This is our land, anybody else's land, and we need to be able to do better. Mr. Speaker, when I talked about bringing forward expenditure, you will see little or no money in here for the National Botanical Gardens, because we are going to vote money before the end of this fiscal year that will allow the NCC to be able to carry out some of the duties of that, and we hope to form the trust at last that will allow that entity to start raising its own money in addition to whatever funds the government will give it. As I said, similarly with Queen's Park, we will start that process only to the extent that we have some fiscal space left at the end of this capital year. One, at the end of this fiscal year. One, because this is a one-off capital project. And if we put the money there, we can start the work which will provide jobs for people while at the same time meeting the needs of being able to ensure that Queen's Park becomes, and I'm sure Barbadians will want to rename it at the appropriate time, but as a gift to the Republic of Barbados. Mr. Speaker, as I say so, I hope also to meet with the Transition Committee to the status of Republic this week, and I will be in a position to better update the country after meeting with that committee and to let others know what arrangements will be put in place as we go forward. Without prejudice to that, and you hear me say, because you know, when you go through COVID, you really understand that both the tangible and the intangible matter, both the concrete and the spiritual matter. And to that extent, there are some other things as a nation that we need to do. I was Minister of Culture when we first introduced the system of national heroes. Back, it was either 1998 or 1999, I can't remember. Getting in this thing too long now. No, but the actual thing was 98 or 99. We did Emancipation Day one year, and we did the National Heroes the other year. And we said always then that we would relook the system in 15 to 20 years, because we were conscious that we needed to continue to modernize and to be able to capture some of whom we may not have captured, while at the same time look and see who else has emerged that may be worthy of consideration. Mr. Speaker, I did not fully appreciate the wisdom of that decision of national heroes until I started to interact in the primary and secondary schools and with young people in this country. The things that they can tell you about the national heroes that kids could not tell you before. Nobody didn't know anything really about Buster other than they had some people who would gather and have these emancipation talks and walks, and that was the end of that. Nobody really didn't know anything about Charles Duncan O'Neill. They didn't know anything about, sufficiently about Sir Frank Walker other than Union Speaks, or Sir Hugh Springer, or he was a Governor General. He ran somewhere about here before, I can't remember. Those were the kinds of responses you got from people. Not to mention our one living hero who continues to occupy. I swear that Sir Gary Sobers must be the most loved person in this country, from all backgrounds, all ages, everything. He is a gentleman truly as much as he is a hero. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that the time has come as the Governor General said in his own speech, for us to re-examine the institution of heroes again and to ask Barbadians to have a say in two things. One, to recommend who else should be considered for heroes, the installation under the statutory framework of national heroes. And then secondly, to recommend what should take the place of Lord Nelson's statue in National Heroes Square. Should it be a representation of all of the heroes as busts? Should it be a representation of a family, which I must tell you I am disposed to, because that was the location upon which families were broken up when they landed here from Africa. Should it be some other kind of representation? I don't know. But we will have a two-step process, and the Minister in the Ministry of Culture, the Honourable Member for St. Philip West, will help me manage it. One, that we will go to the public now for recommendations for national heroes to be recommended by a committee, then for it to come to Cabinet for final settlement. And we would want to be able to announce that by National Heroes Day. But secondly, that we would also have a framework for the concept, not the actual design, but the concept of what should go in National Heroes Square. And thirdly, what should Queen's Park be renamed as going forward as a gift to the Republic of Barbados. The Republic is still a constitutional monarchy. Don't mind all the foolish talk that people would want you to hear. But what matters is that we give that Barbadian boy or girl the chance to believe that they can be head of state in their own country, the most natural of their aspirations and expressions, in a way that children in the US, children in the UK, children in Brazil can believe that they can grow up literally in the US and Brazil, sorry, not the UK, can grow up to be the head of state in their own country. These intangible things matter. But let's flip now to the tangible. When we finish the works at Fairchild Street with the vending, we've indicated that they must go between BTII and the UDC must go, and also look, Baxter's Road is looking very, very bad and very, very popped down. And across the little mall that goes across Westbury Road too. And we've also indicated we will finish the work at Temple Yard, having put the water and the electricity there. But we must go at the back of Fairchild Street into the river bus stand and deal with down there too. Because those people down there are being made victims of flooding. There's no proper framework. They just need to be allowed to feel that they belong to this country and that they can operate in a clean and dignified way in the heart of Bridgetown. And that's why I say that our approach to Bridgetown has changed. In addition, whenever the Hyatt does start, one of the things that we put in there as a planning gain is a contribution to an urban transformation fund that we will use now to help those who live in the housing areas. Now, I would love to have been in a position to do fully, as Minister responsible for the Urban Development Commission in this year alone, an urban renewal area as a pilot, expanding the same Murphy Pasture area, taking all between Westbury Road, come down Baxter's Road to Tudor Street, in by Reed Street, come across by Lakes Folly, and back up Fontebelle. And you take that rectangle, more or less, and seek to build up and improve the conditions of persons living in there. And I say to this Honourable Chamber, that is where the government is going. We can't afford to do it all in one go, but as God is my witness, we are going to get there, because we cannot uplift the standards for others in Bridgetown, and those who live in Bridgetown are left living in the worst conditions, largely because they're under seawater in those areas, that they're below sea level, sorry, in those areas. So, Mr. Speaker, these are but some of the things. Mr. Speaker, I will say this before I end. This government also had the Minister of Foreign Affairs address it 2 Saturdays ago. And as he did so, before I go that, let me just say something on finance. The Financial Services Tribunal, as addressed by Her Excellency in the throne speech, will also be established in this next fiscal year. And this is to address long-standing complaints of consumers for financial institutions, for the conduct of financial institutions. We believe that the rights of citizens to financial services is critical, and that if we're going to have financial inclusion, we have to do this. It's one of the reasons as well why the digitization of payments and why we're having the new framework for our payments in the country. All of these things are helping us to move to a stage where we can allow for greater financial inclusion. It is why the Minister of Small Business has been mandated as well, not just to bring legislation for the decriminalization of vending, not just to expand opportunities to the vendors and all of the others under fund access and trust loans, both of which receive capitalization in this through supplementaries this year and will continue to, and both of which helped us to support all of those people who had to be supported, from shop owners to vendors to fish market persons, to all of them during the national pause in February. But separate from all of that good work they're doing there, we need a comprehensive program of financial literacy. But we understand the importance of everybody being able to read and write in this country so nobody don't take advantage of them. But I want us to understand the importance too of understanding how our financial system works. Because if we allow people to understand it, then they're in a better position to invest and to do things rather than simply putting money in a bank and getting, in fact, you're paying the bank to keep the money as a security service, because the interest is so low and the fees are so high that at the end of the day, you paying the bank more than the bank is giving you. And that is why the Financial Services Tribunal is so critical. Mr. Speaker, I have, for example, a meeting with the Kenya Commercial Group tomorrow morning, trying to link them with local providers. And why? Because the level of sophistication that they have had to show in their market, they went through the same thing. Barclays Bank and others picked up and left them in a lurch. And they had to rush and find how were they going to meet the needs of ordinary Kenyans and to bring about financial inclusion. And in circumstances where the population is 49 million and where the country is hundreds of thousands of square miles. And what did they do? They used the technology to suit them. But they also anchored it in transparency. You go on the Kenya Commercial Bank website now, and you will see the list of all tariffs charged by the banks, all fees and rates paid by the bank. And that is where this country must go, so that Bajans feel, whether it is banks or credit unions, that there is a level of transparency and a level of commitment to protecting their rights in this country. Mr. Speaker, consumer protection and dispute resolution will also be a key component of the legislation coming to establish the Financial Services Tribunal. There will also be a new customs bill, Mr. Speaker. The Customs Act under which we are operating is arcane and archaic and inappropriate for a modern Barbados. We've already had a number of reforms to the Customs Department. We were able to put a control of customs in place in circumstances where there was no appointed controller in this country for more than a decade. And as I used to call it, it was Hollywood. Everybody in customs was acting. And then what made it worse was the intransigence of the previous government and the previous Minister of Public Service, who could have easily created the post of Customs Officer 4, which we have created, and that has led to the appointment of more than 120-something persons. But you know, Mr. Speaker, the more I talk, the more I realize I'm forgetting. Because this is the same government that on the 1st of October made it possible for public servants who have been acting in position for 3 years or more to be appointed without more in this country, in the middle of a pandemic. If I had to draw a metaphor, sir, even when the bowling is tough, even when the Yorkers are coming, this government is finding its way to look and play selective shots, not random, reckless shots, selective shots that can improve the condition of Barbadians, whether as savers by receiving the arrears, victims of CLICO and BICO, public servants who had no pay increase for 10 years, who got a 5% increase, who on top of that got a compensatory income credit such that any person earning between $25,000 and $35,000 a year, just over 2,000 Barbados dollars a month and just under 3,000 a month, would have received back as part of that $62.6 million in refunds all of the taxes that they paid in the income year 2019 to 2020 in the middle of a pandemic, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hear sincerely the concerns of those who are worried about the minimum wage. I hear the concerns, you know. But this government has determined that we have to, I kid you not, that we have to consider a fair wage or even a living wage for people in this country. And that people who believe that it is going to trigger all kinds of increases are not applying themselves or their hearts to wisdom or to the fact that we need to be fair first and foremost. There are some wages that people cannot support their families on. And that is why this government is making the decision to go this route. And let us be clear, when you pay certain people more money, especially at the top, they save it. When you pay people at the bottom who are not getting enough already, they spend it. And once they start to spend, the money starts to circulate in the same economy. So that those people who want to arbitrarily, even before this thing is given a chance, carry up prices, rest assured we have eyes, we have hands, we have a voice, and we have parliament. And we have parliament. I am not going to agree that people are going to be unfair in this country because this government is doing the right thing, which should have been done by a government of Barbados to protect those at the bottom of the working chain in this country from unreasonably low wages. And therefore, come April, as promised, April 1 will not be an April Fool's joke for those earning minimum wages in this country. It will be a new deal, not an April Fool's joke. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to Cabinet receiving, therefore, this week the draft order that will complete the process. We have gone through the Blue Ribbon Committee. We've come back to Cabinet. We've published in accordance with the legislation. The time is now to consummate the deal with ordinary working Barbadians who have little or no options other than to rely on a government intervening on their own behalf in this nation. Sir, I also indicated that we need to have legislation governing fair credit reporting to allow on the appropriate establishment for credit bureaus. But it would be naive of me not to recognize that even just the establishment of the National Digital ID card is going to make it that much easier, particularly if you have a digital payment system, because if you're using a digital payment system, it then makes it easier for those who are doing the reporting to gather the information so that persons' credit can be assessed quicker and persons can therefore leverage their credit in order to expand, whether in their homes or in their businesses as necessary. Mr. Speaker, this government also took some decisions, and go back to Her Excellency's throne speech. We will be faithful to what we've said there as far as possible. But we also indicated that, and you heard me today talk about fiscal space and policy space. It's not with the social partnership that I'm having those discussions, regrettably alone. It's not with people regionally alone that we're having these discussions. We're having to have these discussions globally. And we have to reorder our foreign diplomatic and commercial trade relations more and more. And that is why we've said that we will claim our continental destiny by also establishing linkages with Africa and Panama. the area from which we came and the area to which we sent a lot of people in Central America. We also are anchored within the region. Barbados has very, very close bilateral relations with the Eastern Caribbean, with Guyana, with Trinidad and Tobago. We have developed closer relations with Suriname recently, and we want to do the same with Bahamas and Belize within CARICOM, and indeed with some of our overseas territory partners within the CARICOM region, from Cayman Islands to Bermuda to BVI to Turks and Caicos, and of course to the US Virgin Islands, who face the same circumstances as we do. Why? Because at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we believe that it is important that as we go forward, that we strengthen our bilateral relationships, the traditional ones, the Canadas, the US, the UK, Europe, but the new ones too, because it is in the new ones that the opportunities come. And that is why we expect that over the course of the next year going forward, that our determination to be able to establish new entities, particularly given that technology allows us to do it with very few people now in place, rather than large numbers as was needed before, that we need to do it. Because somebody, I'll never forget, Mr. Arthur used to tell me all the time, things happen when somebody comes to work every day to make it happen. Never forgotten it. And therefore, if we want to see progress on these multiple fronts, then we need to be able to have persons positioned to do so. At the same time, we have to reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism. And you've heard me say so over and over. So how can you have 3 United Nations headquarters in the world? One in New York. We get that because you go to the General Assembly and the Security Council there, and that's the main location. One in Geneva. We have to get that because the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and other entities that are critical for us are in Geneva. But you know what we never got? That the agencies that are most important to a 21st century Barbados have no direct representation from Barbados. And what are those agencies, sir? The United Nations Environmental Program. It's not in New York. It's not in Geneva. It is in Nairobi, in Kenya. The 3rd UN headquarters is the only one in the south of the world. Is the only one in a developing country. Is the only one in a country whose history and journey is similar to ours. But for 55 years, we send to Geneva and to New York. And we leave out Nairobi. And UN Habitat, you heard me talk about our housing problems. UN Habitat and UN Environmental Program are there in Nairobi. So you begin to understand why the government felt, and thanks to the government of Kenya and to the governments in the United Arab Emirates, we're not paying for the accommodation. But separate from that, even if we were, we can no longer not be at the table with the one agency that determines what Barbados is 50 years, 70 years, or 100 years from now. How much is underwater and how much is above water? These are the fundamental issues that have changed. And when you hear me therefore talk about this, or talk about having to develop new productive sectors in renewable energy and medicinal cannabis, or having to conduct business that is global now rather than an international business sector. All business, local business is global, and all global business is local. Let us understand that the conditions and the world in which this country lives is no longer in the 1980s or the 1990s or even the early 2000s. When I came to public life, nobody really spoke about environment. Now everything that we talk about has a reference to the climate crisis or to the environment, blue or green. Nobody talked when I came into public life in 1989 about the World Trade Organization or about what we could do. We still had all them garment firms and putting all kind of quotas and non-tariff measures in place when I first came to public life. that protected domestic manufacturing, much of which has had to be removed, and much of which domestic manufacturing has been lost. And therefore, what we have to do now is to create a manufacturing sector that is built not on high volume, low value manufacturing, but is built on high value, low volume manufacturing or high value research. And that is why the free zone is so critical to us in order to be able to complement already what we've done with the reduction of corporate taxation in this country. Mr. Speaker, this is a different Barbados in which we live. When I came to public life, we had diplomatic relations with China, but we did not have the level of deep engagement with the Chinese that we have today. And therefore, having an office there is absolutely critical. And to use Barbadians who are fluent now in Mandarin becomes the order of the day, because before, people would rush and try and speak English because they felt that they were on the ascendancy. But now when they're almost there, you guys rush and speak Mandarin. It's called being unequally yoked. And then literally the tables turning. Mr. Speaker, we have therefore taken decisions, and it has not cost us more than just over $1 million for all of these to be able to have a presence in a number of jurisdictions that we believe will make a fundamental difference to the economic and commercial opportunities available to our country for the trade in services and goods going forward. But equally also for the influence that we must also come to carry in order to be able to create the policy space and the fiscal space that are so necessary for the conduct of our domestic affairs. Barbadians did not realize that when Tom Adams brought the international business sector into this country, that its growth would allow us to have reduced taxes on a range of income, corporation, and land taxes because of the extent to which that was contributing to the corporation tax revenue in this country. And I want us, therefore, to have these discussions because the world in which we live is significantly different from the one in which we have grown up. And unless we are in a position to carry our people along every step of the way, then we may be minded to make decisions that do not benefit us in the long run, out of fear and out of fake news. The two F words that must be left out of our conversation as a nation. Mr. Speaker, I am not going to keep this house much longer. I've spoken more than I wanted to, but I feel, and I feel it, but I feel that even at this most difficult time in our nation's history, that Barbados has a bright future ahead of it. We have known what it is to work hard for anything that we want. That's been our lot in life. But even as we work hard, we know that once we prepare ourselves, once we remain faithful to it, that we can make it. Is there room for improvement for everyone? There is. There's room for improvement for me. There's room for improvement for everybody in this chamber. There's room for improvement in the public service as it reorients itself to deal with a different environment because we're no longer dealing with the analog Barbados of the middle 20th century. There is room for improvement from the private sector. I haven't talked a lot about the doing business initiatives or the fact that we're going to have to put in and move in money for our delivery unit because the truth is that Barbados' traditional economic advantage came from having a stronger, well-performing public service than most countries in the world. But many of the countries have leapfrogged us. Many of the countries have introduced systems that we didn't want to introduce for all kinds of reasons or that the previous government ignored. Whatever the reason, they have leapfrogged us in too many instances. And now is the time for us to take back control. Mr. Speaker, we lost some things that we wanted to do in the last year. I hope we can do them in this next year. We want to create a balance sheet of our non-performing assets known as the Barbados Legacy Fund so that we can start to export capital so that the next time there is a major domestic recession or depression, that we can still be earning from outside and not only from what we can earn within. That is why I say I'm not only interested in GDP, but also in gross national income, because what we earn, whether on this rock or outside of this rock, must come to matter as we go forward. Mr. Speaker, if there's a lesson in all of this, it is that the engagement must be real, must be continual, and must not be abandoned. Because I know that within the context of this nation, we have the capacity, we have the resilience, we have the character to be able to get through this journey. Recognizing that even as we seek to do so, we remain at risk to other threats that are beyond our control. But I know, as I've said over and over in the last year, just as the Minister of Health has said that there shall be no retreat or no surrender, I know that with the Lord on our side, we shall have no doubts nor fears, and that we shall continue to carry this country from strength to strength. These estimates represent the first step in 2021 to 22 as we try to turn the corner from what will come to be regarded as one of our bleakest years. 2020 was the year to perfect vision. It perfected it, but not in the way we expected. It perfected it because it allowed us to remember the value of life, of family, of a job, of our environment, of so many things that we had taken for granted for too long, not just here, but globally. It is up to us to allow that renewed commitment not to evaporate, but to be built upon, such that that wish that I expressed on 2nd of January 2020, for us to become world-class by 2027, can be resumed as a national journey on which all of us are committed. And as I keep saying, I don't need to get there with you, but I need us to stay the course. And I mean that sincerely, because this country will only regain its preeminent position if it is prepared to do the hard things that it used to do, and that it stopped doing simply because we didn't like to hear the voice of people complaining, or we didn't like to do the difficult things, or we didn't like to have the difficult conversations. All of us know nothing in life comes without sometimes confronting challenging circumstances. And we, Mr. Speaker, as a government, will remain committed to the people of this nation, because we feel that Barbadians have already been exposed to far more than they needed to have been exposed. But we need now to learn the lessons and to commit one by one, all of us, to being able to make this nation that place where all of us, those who are born here and those who are descendants from those who are born here, want to be here as a matter of choice, not as a matter of obligation. Why? Because it will provide the best living for all of us that it can possibly do, while never forgetting that our history demands of us to remain faithful to protecting the most vulnerable, and equally to attaining levels of excellence that wherever people reflect or remark on who we are and what we are about, they say that that is a country that punches above its weight, that takes care of its people, and that truly, in spite of it being just a rock, 166 square miles, has added more to the global conversation for the improvement of humanity than most with many more. Mr. Speaker, I ask that this Honourable Chamber approve these estimates of expenditure and revenue, recognizing that there will be midterm adjustments in September, October again, because regrettably, that is the world in which we live, in which there is not the capacity to be able to predict and project and estimate for long periods of time, because there are simply too many intervening factors. And with that in mind, therefore, I commend these estimates and beg to move that this bill be now read a second time. I'm obliged to you, sir.
Honourable Leader, Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe the Honourable Prime Minister has given us much food for thought, but I believe that this is a perfect time. Much food for thought, but I believe this is a perfect time for us all to break for lunch and to come back at 3:20 p.m.
Questions that this Honourable Chamber be suspended until 3:20 p.m. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. This Honourable Chamber stands suspended until 3:20 p.m.